These seats aren't meant for passengers like you. I need to see your boarding passes again." The words hung in the air of the first-class cabin, sharp and cutting. They weren't whispered or mumbled, but delivered with the practiced authority of someone who expected immediate compliance. Melissa Winters, senior flight attendant for Atlantic Airways, stood with perfect posture in the aisle, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun, her uniform crisp and immaculate. Her smile remained fixed on her face, but her eyes were cold as she held out her hand expectantly toward the couple seated in 2A and 2B. James Bennett looked up from his book, his expression calm but questioning. His wife Nicole placed her hand gently on his arm, a subtle gesture they'd perfected over 15 years of marriage. Around them, several passengers paused their pre-flight routines, attention drawn by Melissa's tone rather than her words. What no one in the cabin realized in that moment, not Melissa Winters, with her 22 years of flight experience, not Captain William Bradford in the cockpit, finalizing his pre-flight checks, not the curious passengers settling into their premium seats, was that in exactly 47 minutes, 3 aviation careers would end, and an entire airline would face a reckoning that would reshape its future. James Bennett was a man who noticed details. It was both a professional requirement and a personal habit. At 46, he had spent over 2 decades ensuring that others didn't miss what mattered. As a senior safety inspector for the Federal Aviation Administration, he was responsible for making sure airlines complied with federal regulations down to the letter. His evaluations could ground entire fleets or clear them for the skies. Today, however, he wasn't on duty. The crisp FAA credentials that usually hung around his neck were tucked away in his carry-on. His tailored suit was replaced by premium dark jeans and a navy cashmere sweater, comfortable but quality travel clothes with no obvious markers of status or authority. He wore a simple platinum wedding band and a watch that, while expensive, wasn't flashy. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and his brown eyes, usually scanning for safety violations, were instead focused on the novel in his hands, at least until Melissa Winters' voice cut through his concentration. James had worked his way up through the FAA ranks methodically and earned a reputation for being both fair and thorough. He began as a maintenance inspector straight out of the Air Force, where he'd served as an aircraft mechanic. He understood the complex ballet of aircraft operations from the tarmac to the tower. When he conducted an inspection, airline executives held their breath. Not because he was punitive, he wasn't, but because he missed nothing. His evaluations were detailed, precise, and uncompromising when it came to passenger safety. His colleagues described him as calm under pressure, measured in his responses, and clear in his expectations. These same qualities defined his personal life. When faced with discrimination, something that had happened with disappointing regularity throughout his life and career, James typically responded with the same careful evaluation he applied to his work: assess the situation, determine the severity, and decide whether intervention was necessary. Born in Chicago to a father who taught mathematics and a mother who practiced law, James had been raised to believe in systems processes and the careful application of rules. If the rules are fair and applied equally, justice follows, his mother used to say. His father would add, and if they're not fair, you work to change them from within. This philosophy had guided James through college at Howard University, through his military service, and through his rise at the FAA. What those who worked with him professionally didn't always see was the toll that constant vigilance took. The exhaustion that came from always having to prove himself, from having his authority questioned in ways his white colleagues rarely experienced. Only Nicole fully understood this weight, the careful calibration of responses, the energy spent navigating spaces where he was often the only black person in the room. Today was supposed to be different. Today was about stepping away from responsibility, about celebrating 15 years with the woman who understood him best. Paris awaited them, a city they'd visited once before on their honeymoon, before careers and obligations had made such indulgences rare. This trip had been planned for months, the first-class tickets purchased as a special treat, a departure from their usual practical approach to travel. As Melissa Winters stood expectantly before him, James felt the familiar shift inside the pivot from relaxed traveler to alert professional. The mental calculation beginning how to respond, how much energy to expend, whether this was a battle worth fighting on what was supposed to be the beginning of a well-earned vacation. Dr. Nicole Bennett could read an aircraft the way musicians read sheet music. As an aerospace engineer and human factors specialist for the FAA, she understood not just the mechanics of flight, but the complex interplay between human operators and the machines they controlled. At 43, she had built a career analyzing how fatigue, stress, and environmental factors affected crew performance and passenger safety. Her credentials were impeccable: a PhD in aeronautical engineering from MIT, 15 years at the FAA, and a list of publications that had helped shape modern cockpit design and emergency response protocols. Airlines across the country had implemented her recommendations on crew rest requirements and communication procedures. When Nicole Bennett spoke at industry conferences, people took notes. Unlike her husband, whose authority often faced subtle and not-so-subtle challenges, Nicole's expertise was rarely questioned directly. Instead, she encountered a different kind of bias, the assumption that her achievements were somehow exceptional for a woman, or surprise that someone with her warm demeanor could possess such technical knowledge. Nicole had perfected the art of the gentle correction, the firm redirection, making her points with clarity while maintaining relationships. Today she wore a simple but elegant cream blouse, tailored black pants, and comfortable ballet flats for the long flight. Her blonde hair fell in loose waves to her shoulders, and her blue eyes, sharp and observant, caught every detail of the interaction unfolding before her. Like James, she'd left the trappings of her professional identity behind, looking forward to being simply Nicole the traveler, Nicole the wife, rather than Dr. Bennett the FAA specialist. Their interracial marriage had drawn attention over the years, sometimes curious, sometimes disapproving. They'd developed a shorthand for navigating these moments, a squeeze of the hand, or a particular look that communicated volumes between them. When they'd first met at an aviation safety conference in Dallas, it had been Nicole who approached James after his presentation on maintenance oversight improvements. She'd challenged one of his conclusions. He'd invited her to continue the discussion over coffee, and 6 hours later, they were still talking, having moved from professional disagreement to personal connection. What had impressed Nicole most about James wasn't his expertise, though that was considerable, but his willingness to listen, to consider perspectives different from his own. In an industry dominated by certainty and hierarchy, his openness stood out. Over the years, their professional approaches had influenced each other. James adopting some of Nicole's emphasis on human factors and communication, Nicole incorporating James's meticulous attention to regulatory detail. They had faced prejudice before, most memorably during a dinner at an upscale restaurant in Houston 3 years ago. The maitre d' had assumed James was there to pick up a takeout order rather than join the table of airline executives waiting inside. Nicole had watched as James handled the situation with a dignity that simultaneously educated the staff without creating a scene. Later in private, he'd allowed himself to express the anger and hurt such incidents caused, and she'd listened. Understanding that her experience as a white woman meant she could never fully comprehend his reality, but committed to standing with him nonetheless. As Melissa Winters looked down at them expectantly, Nicole felt herself shift into the protective mode that had become second nature in these situations, not because James needed protecting, but because she understood the unfair burden he carried in such moments. Her expression remained pleasant, but her mind was already cataloging details with professional precision. Melissa's tone, her body language, the specific wording of her request, and the reactions of those around them. The planning for this anniversary trip had begun 6 months earlier, when James and Nicole realized they hadn't taken a proper vacation in nearly 3 years. The demands of their positions at the FAA meant they were often traveling separately for work. James conducting inspections across the country, Nicole consulting on human factors issues or testifying before safety boards. When they were home together in their Falls Church, Virginia townhouse, they were usually catching up on work or recovering from travel. 15 years deserve something special, James had said one Sunday morning as they sat on their small patio enjoying a rare, leisurely breakfast. What if we went back to Paris? Do it right this time. Their honeymoon in Paris had been magical but brief, just 4 days snatched between work commitments and on a newlywed budget that meant a small hotel room and carefully planned meals. This time would be different. 2 full weeks a suite at Le Bristol and first-class flights on Atlantic Airways, known for its premium service on transatlantic routes. They'd splurged on the tickets, choosing seats 2A and 2B in the first-class cabin of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner that would carry them to Charles de Gaulle Airport. The irony wasn't lost on them that they were selecting an airline James had inspected just 8 months earlier, an inspection that had resulted in several safety protocol updates but had ultimately been passed. It was a personal trip, not professional, but their knowledge of the industry inevitably informed their choices. Denver International Airport hummed with activity around them as they made their way to the Atlantic Airways check-in counter. The soaring white peaks of the terminal roof arched overhead like massive tents, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. Travelers rushed past with rolling suitcases. Airport announcements echoed through the vast space, and the scent of coffee from numerous kiosks permeated the air. Despite being officially off-duty, both James and Nicole found themselves automatically noting details, the positioning of the emergency exit signs, the flow patterns of foot traffic, the efficiency of the security screening process. It was an occupational hazard, this constant awareness of safety systems and potential improvements. "We're going to have to work on turning off our work brains," Nicole said with a smile as she caught James eyeing a slightly crooked placard displaying emergency procedures. "Says the woman who just commented on the optimal spacing of the check-in kiosks," he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Their shared laughter carried them through the premium security lane and toward the first-class lounge, where they planned to relax before boarding. James carried their shared carry-on bag they'd packed light planning to shop in Paris, while Nicole scrolled through their digital boarding passes on her phone. "I still can't believe we're doing this," she said as they approached the lounge entrance. 2 weeks in Paris, no inspections, no reports, no emergency consultations. "I'll believe it when we're actually in French airspace," James replied, only half joking. Their last 3 vacation attempts had been interrupted by work emergencies, most recently a weather-related incident in Dallas that had required Nicole's immediate assessment of communication breakdowns among ground crews. As they settled into the plush seats of the Atlantic Airways first-class lounge, surrounded by muted luxury and attentive service, they allowed themselves to begin the mental transition from FAA officials to vacationing couple. They accepted glasses of champagne from a passing attendant, clinked them together in a small toast to 15 years, and began to feel the weight of responsibility lift, if only temporarily. "To Paris," James said, his deep voice soft with anticipation. "To us," Nicole replied, her blue eyes holding his brown ones, with the ease of long partnership. Neither of them could have predicted how dramatically different this journey would be from the one they'd planned. The Atlantic Airways check-in process had been surprisingly pleasant. Thomas Rodriguez, a gate agent with a ready smile and efficient manner, had greeted them warmly, complimenting them on their choice of dates. April in Paris is magical, and upgrading their seat assignments from 3A and 3B to 2A and 2B when he noticed a gap in the seating chart. "It's your anniversary trip, you should have the very best," he'd said, typing quickly on his keyboard. "Those seats have a bit more privacy and a better view during takeoff." In the first-class lounge, they'd settled into a quiet corner with their champagne, observing their fellow travelers. A silver-haired executive type loudly discussed merger options on his phone. A well-dressed older couple studied a Paris guidebook together, marking pages with sticky notes. A young woman in designer clothes scrolled through her phone, occasionally taking selfies against the backdrop of the lounge's elegant decor. When the boarding announcement came, they gathered their belongings and made their way to Gate A32, where Atlantic Airways Flight 370 to Paris was preparing for departure. As first-class passengers, they were invited to board immediately, bypassing the lines forming for later boarding groups. As they approached the jet bridge entrance, Nicole noticed the first subtle shift in atmosphere. The gate agent checking boarding passes, not Thomas Rodriguez, who had helped them earlier, but an older woman with pinched features, gave them a second glance as she scanned their passes. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but Nicole caught at that moment of surprise, of recalibration. "Enjoy your flight," the agent said, her tone neutral but her smile not quite reaching her eyes. James focused on ensuring their carry-on was securely zipped, didn't notice the momentary hesitation. It was so slight that Nicole almost questioned whether she'd imagined it a product of heightened sensitivity from past experiences. She said nothing, not wanting to introduce tension before their trip had even properly begun. They walked down the jet bridge together, the muted thrum of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit growing louder as they approached the plane. At the aircraft door, a male flight attendant greeted the passengers ahead of them, the silver-haired executive from the lounge with enthusiastic deference. "Welcome aboard, sir. Right this way to your suite. May I take your jacket?" As James and Nicole stepped forward, they encountered Melissa Winters for the first time. Her welcoming smile flickered almost imperceptibly as her eyes moved from Nicole to James, that fraction of a second where surprise registered before professional training reasserted itself. "Welcome aboard," she said, her tone a few degrees cooler than it had been for the previous passenger. She glanced at their boarding passes longer than necessary before gesturing them forward. "Seats 2A and 2B are to your left." They made their way into the first-class cabin, a spacious area with just 8 private suites arranged in a 1-2-1 configuration. The central pair of suites 2D and 2G were already occupied by the older couple from the lounge, who nodded politely as James and Nicole passed. The young woman with the designer clothes was settling into 1A directly in front of their assigned seats. The suites themselves were impressive, wide, comfortable seats that converted to fully flat beds, large entertainment screens, ample storage space, and sliding doors that could be closed for privacy during the flight. As they stowed their carry-on in the overhead bin and settled into their seats, Nicole allowed herself to relax slightly. Perhaps the momentary tensions at boarding were nothing, just her professional habit of hyper-awareness, detecting patterns where none existed. Then Melissa Winters returned to their row, and the first clear hint of trouble emerged. "These seats aren't meant for passengers like you. I need to see your boarding passes again." James reached for his phone where the digital boarding pass was stored, maintaining his composed expression despite the immediate recognition of what was happening. He'd heard variations of that phrase throughout his life, not meant for people like you, and its implications were never subtle, never innocent. "Of course," he said, his voice steady as he displayed the screen toward Melissa. "Seats 2A and 2B Atlantic Airways, Flight 370 to Paris." Melissa took the phone from his hand, studying the boarding pass with exaggerated scrutiny. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she swiped to view Nicole's pass as well. These were upgraded at the gate. She asked the question, carrying an unmistakable note of suspicion. "The agent was kind enough to move us forward 1 row," Nicole explained with a pleasant smile that masked her growing awareness of the situation. "We were originally in 3A and 3B. "I see," Melissa replied, though her tone suggested she saw something entirely different than what the boarding passes showed. She handed the phone back to James, her fingers barely touching his as though avoiding contact. "There seemed to be a lot of last-minute changes to our manifest today." The cabin around them was a study in luxury. Each first-class suite featured hand-stitched leather seats in deep navy-polished wood accents and customized lighting. The central divider between James and Nicole's seats could be lowered to create a shared space or raised for privacy. The air carried the subtle scent of the airline's signature fragrance, something with notes of bergamot and cedar, and the background hum of the ventilation system was designed to create a peaceful environment. None of these carefully engineered comforts could mask the discomfort now building in Suite 2A and 2B. "Is there a problem with our seats?" James asked, directly maintaining eye contact with Melissa. "No problem," she replied with a tight smile. "I just need to ensure everyone is properly situated." As she walked away, Nicole reached across the divider to touch James's hand. "That was—" "I know," he said quietly. "Let's see how it plays out." A moment later, they observed Melissa speaking in low tones to another flight attendant, Kevin Powell, according to his name tag. He was tall and trim with closely cropped brown hair, perhaps mid-30s, and as Melissa spoke, his gaze drifted toward James and Nicole. His expression shifted from neutral to something more guarded, and he nodded at whatever Melissa was telling him. James turned to look out the window at the ground crew finalizing their preparations, consciously maintaining his calm demeanor. After 22 years at the FAA, he'd developed a professional persona that served as armor in challenging situations. He deployed it now, focusing on his breathing on the facts of the situation rather than the emotions beginning to simmer beneath the surface. Nicole, meanwhile, reached for the glossy first-class menu tucked into the seat pocket, opening it, but not really seeing the curated selection of French-inspired cuisine described inside. Her mind was already cataloging the interaction, breaking it down the way she would analyze a cockpit communication failure, initial trigger response patterns, escalation factors. "I was so looking forward to turning off the analyst part of my brain on this trip," she murmured with a small sigh. "Same," James replied. "But we're not letting this define our vacation. Let's just get through boarding and take off. Things will settle once we're in the air." Around them, the first-class cabin continued to fill. A distinguished-looking older man took seat 1D directly across from the young woman in designer clothes. The final passenger, a middle-aged man in a perfectly tailored suit, settled into 3A, the seat they had originally been assigned. Kevin Powell approached their row carrying 2 flutes of champagne on a silver tray. Unlike Melissa, who had offered pre-departure beverages to the other first-class passengers minutes earlier, his approach seemed reluctant, obligatory. Champagne before takeoff, he asked, his voice professional but lacking the warmth he'd shown to the passengers in 1D and 3A moments before. "Thank you, that would be lovely," Nicole said, accepting a glass. James nodded his thanks as he took the second flute, noticing how Kevin placed it on the console rather than handing it directly to him. "Have you flown Atlantic Airways first class?" before Kevin asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. "We have," James replied simply, offering no further explanation. Kevin's eyebrows lifted slightly in apparent surprise. "Well, let me know if you need help with any of the suite features. The control panel can be a bit complicated for first-timers." The condescension was subtle but unmistakable. As Kevin moved away, Nicole took a sip of her champagne, using the glass to partially hide her expression from the other passengers. 3 for 3, she said quietly. "Let's not count. Yet," James replied, though they both knew the pattern was establishing itself with depressing familiarity. Outside their window, baggage handlers loaded the last of the luggage into the aircraft's hold. The late morning sun glinted off the plane's massive General Electric engines. Under different circumstances, James might have appreciated the engineering marvel that would soon carry them across the Atlantic. Now he found himself subtly scanning the cabin for potential allies or witnesses if the situation continued to deteriorate. The flow of subtle indignities continued as boarding completed, and the cabin prepared for departure. When Kevin returned to collect their empty champagne glasses, he addressed only Nicole as though James were invisible. "Was everything to your liking, ma'am?" Before Nicole could answer, Melissa appeared at the edge of their suite, offering amenity kits to the first-class passengers. The soft-sided pouches contained luxury skincare products, socks, an eye mask, and other comfort items for the long flight. As she distributed the kits to the other passengers, she described the contents with enthusiasm. "The hand cream is from a wonderful French brand. It's divine for combating the dry cabin air," she told the older couple in 2D and 2G. When she reached James and Nicole, she simply placed the kits on their consoles without comment and moved on. It was a small thing, just a missing description, a lack of the personal touch offered to others, but it registered in the growing catalog of differential treatment. James shifted in his seat, focusing on the positive. They were still going to Paris. The flight would last 9 hours, and then they'd be free of this increasingly uncomfortable environment. He turned his attention to the entertainment system, browsing through the movie selections as a distraction. Nicole, however, was finding it harder to ignore the pattern. As a human factors specialist, she was trained to identify subtle breakdowns in professional behavior before they cascaded into larger failures. What she was observing went beyond individual rudeness into something more troubling, a coordinated shift in service standards based entirely on perception. "I'm going to use the lavatory before takeoff," she told James, squeezing his hand briefly before standing. As she made her way to the front of the cabin, she noticed how Melissa stepped aside for her with a tight smile, but no words. When Nicole returned a few minutes later, she overheard Kevin speaking with the passenger in 1A, the young woman with designer clothes. "Ms. Lewis, would you prefer your bed made up during dinner or after?" Kevin asked, his tone warm and attentive. "After dinner, I think," the woman replied. "And please call me Heather." "Of course, Heather. I'll make sure your turn-down service is perfectly timed." As Nicole passed them, Kevin's demeanor shifted subtly, his smile becoming fixed and professional rather than genuine. Nicole nodded politely as she returned to her seat, noting that no one had asked her or James about their turn-down preferences. "Everything okay?" James asked quietly as she settled back beside him. "Fine," she replied, though they both understood the subtext. The safety demonstration began with Kevin and Melissa demonstrating the use of oxygen masks and life vests at the front of the cabin. James watched with professional interest, despite having seen hundreds of such demonstrations. As a safety inspector, he automatically assessed the clarity and accuracy of the presentation. Nicole leaned closer. "Remember when you found 3 procedural errors in United's safety demo last year?" James smiled slightly. "I try not to be that guy when we're off duty." "I know. I just—" Nicole hesitated. "I'm trying to remember why we're here. The vacation, not this situation." James's expression softened. "Paris," he reminded her. 15 years. That's what matters." After the safety demonstration, as the aircraft pushed back from the gate and the engines began their powerful whine, Melissa made one final pass through the cabin to check that seats were upright and tray tables stowed. She verified each suite meticulously until she reached James and Nicole. And, "Sir, your tray table," she said to James, though his table was already properly stowed. James glanced down at his completely clear console. "It's already secured," he replied evenly. Melissa's lips thinned. "Please just double-check everything is properly prepared for takeoff." The implication was clear. She assumed he didn't know the procedures, despite every indication that both he and Nicole were experienced travelers. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, James felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Not anxiety about flying, but the weight of having to constantly prove his right to occupy space. He'd felt it in corporate boardrooms at industry conferences, and now, ironically, in a space he'd personally inspected for safety compliance less than a year ago. He thought back to an incident early in his FAA career when he'd arrived to conduct a maintenance inspection at a regional airline. The director of operations had asked him to wait in the lobby, assuming he was a delivery person rather than the federal inspector scheduled for that day. When the misunderstanding was clarified, the director had been mortified, offering profuse apologies. James had proceeded with the inspection professionally, neither acknowledging the awkwardness nor allowing it to influence his evaluation. But he remembered the sting of it, the momentary flash of anger before his professional training took over. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, the powerful thrust pressing them back into their seats as the wheels lifted off the ground and Denver fell away beneath them. Under normal circumstances, this moment, the beginning of their anniversary trip, would have been filled with anticipation and joy. Instead, it was shadowed by the growing awareness that this flight would not be the luxurious experience they had paid for and looked forward to. As the seatbelt sign dinged off and the aircraft leveled at its initial cruising altitude, Nicole reached for James's hand across the lowered divider between their suites. "Maybe it will get better from here," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't really believe it. James squeezed her hand gently, appreciating her optimism even as his own experience told him otherwise. Maybe he agreed, unwilling to dim her hope, but realistic about where things appeared to be heading. Their exchange was interrupted by Kevin approaching with hot towels for the first-class passengers. He offered them to each suite with a friendly comment complimenting Heather Lewis's watch in 1A, asking the older couple in 2D and 2G about their plans in Paris, joking with the businessman in 3A about the Denver traffic. When he reached James and Nicole, he silently extended the towels and moved on without meeting their eyes. "Not better yet," Nicole murmured, taking her towel. James said nothing, but the set of his jaw spoke volumes. 20 minutes into the flight, a new figure emerged from the front galley. He was tall and distinguished-looking, with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His name tag identified him as Richard Turner, head purser. He moved through the first-class cabin with practiced ease, stopping at each suite to personally welcome the passengers and introduce himself. "Mr. and Mrs. Winters," he said to the older couple in 2D and 2G, "welcome aboard. I understand you're celebrating an anniversary this week as well. 40 years, Melissa tells me. Congratulations." The couple beamed at being remembered. Richard continued his rounds, speaking briefly with each passenger until he reached James and Nicole. His smile remained in place, but his eyes hardened slightly. "Good morning," he said, his tone formal. "I trust everything is satisfactory so far." "The flight is fine, thank you," James replied neutrally. Richard lingered, his gaze moving between them as though searching for something. "I understand there was some confusion about your seating assignment at boarding." Nicole responded before James could. "No confusion at all. The gate agent was kind enough to move us from row 3 to row 2. "I see," Richard said in exactly the same tone Melissa had used earlier, suggesting he saw something entirely different. "Well, if you need anything, please don't hesitate to let the crew know." As Richard moved away, they observed him pause to speak with Melissa near the galley. Just like earlier, the two engaged in a whispered conversation with occasional glances in their direction. Melissa nodded at whatever Richard was saying, her expression hardening. James felt his professional instincts activating. As an inspector, he was trained to notice patterns of communication that indicated potential issues in crew dynamics. What he was witnessing now was a textbook example of confirmation bias in action, the crew sharing and reinforcing preconceptions rather than evaluating the actual situation objectively. The cockpit door opened and a man in a pilot's uniform stepped into the cabin. First Officer Andrew Davis, according to his name tag and 4 stripes, was a fit man in his early 40s with close-cropped brown hair and a confident stride. He spoke briefly with Richard before both men looked in James and Nicole's direction. "Now the flight deck is involved." Nicole murmured, her training in crew resource management making the implications clear. "This is escalating in a very familiar pattern." James nodded slightly, his expression neutral but his mind racing. He'd seen similar situations before where a minor misunderstanding, or in this case an unfounded assumption, spread through a crew, creating a distorted picture that everyone began to treat as fact. Richard approached their suite again, this time accompanied by First Officer Davis. The purser's expression was now openly suspicious, his earlier professional veneer wearing thin. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett?" Richard began, his tone suggesting he doubted even their names. "It seems there's some confusion with our passenger manifest today. According to our system, seats 2A and 2B were originally assigned to different passengers. We were upgraded at the gate by Agent Rodriguez. Nicole explained again, her patience wearing thin despite her calm demeanor. Our original assignment was 3A and 3B. We have the boarding passes right here." She reached for James's phone to show the digital passes once more. First Officer Davis spoke up, his voice carrying the artificial calm used when addressing what pilots considered difficult passengers. "We're not questioning your boarding passes, folks. It's just that these particular seats are usually reserved for our highest-tier frequent flyers, and there seems to have been a breakdown in communication. We're just trying to sort it out." James met the pilot's gaze directly. "Our boarding passes are valid. We're in our assigned seats. I'm not clear on what needs to be sorted out." There was a brief flash of annoyance in Davis's eyes, the look of someone not accustomed to having his authority questioned. Richard interjected smoothly, though his tone had cooled further. "The issue, sir, is that these particular suites are premium first-class assignments. They come with certain expectations about the passengers who occupy them." The statement hung in the air, its implications unmistakable. Nicole's eyes widened slightly, and James felt a familiar heat rising in his chest. The controlled anger that came with these moments of naked prejudice barely disguised as policy or procedure. "What exactly are those expectations, Mr. Turner?" James asked, his voice still even, but carrying a new edge of challenge. Richard seemed to realize he'd overstepped his expression, shifting to something more guarded. "Simply that they're typically allocated to our Diamond status members, which is why we're cross-checking the manifest." First Officer Davis glanced at his watch, clearly eager to return to the cockpit. "Look, there's no issue here as long as your boarding passes are legitimate. Richard will verify everything with our ground team and we'll sort it out. Enjoy the flight." As Davis returned to the flight deck, Richard remained standing at the edge of their suite, his discomfort with the situation now evident. "I'll need to see those boarding passes again," he said, his tone making it less a request than a demand. James handed over his phone once more, observing how Richard scrutinized the digital passes as though searching for evidence of forgery. Around them, other first-class passengers had begun to notice the extended interaction, some watching openly, while others pretended absorption in their entertainment screens or magazines. "These appear to be in order," Richard finally admitted, returning the phone with obvious reluctance. "But I'll need to verify with ground operations why a Diamond status allocation was overridden." "Please do," James replied calmly. "In the meantime, I believe the beverage service is beginning for the other passengers." Richard's jaw tightened at the subtle reminder that they were being treated differently, but he nodded curtly and moved away. As he did, James noticed that Kevin was already serving drinks to passengers in row 1, having bypassed their row entirely in the service sequence. "That was direct," Nicole commented quietly. "Sometimes it needs to be," James replied. "They're creating a paper trail of differential treatment, whether they realize it or not." Nicole understood immediately. As FAA officials, they were intimately familiar with how service discrepancies were documented and addressed. Even off-duty, their professional training gave them a framework for processing what was happening, a small mercy in an increasingly uncomfortable situation. "Paris," she reminded him softly. "We're still going to Paris." James nodded, though they both understood that the flight had now transformed into something very different from what they had anticipated. The question was no longer whether they were experiencing discrimination, but how far it would go and how they would respond. 3 rows behind James and Nicole in seat 3G, Emily Carson had been watching the situation unfold with increasing discomfort. At 28, the travel vlogger had built a following of nearly 500,000 subscribers on her channel Emily's Adventures, where she documented luxury travel experiences and cultural insights from around the world. Today's first-class journey to Paris was content for next week's video, and she'd been discreetly filming segments on her phone throughout the boarding process and initial flight phase. What she hadn't expected to capture was the uncomfortable drama playing out with the couple in 2A and 2B. Emily had noticed the subtle shifts in crew behavior, immediately the difference in how Melissa and Kevin addressed James and Nicole compared to other passengers, including herself. As a frequent flyer with an eye for detail, the pattern was unmistakable, and it made her stomach twist with a familiar discomfort. She'd been raised in Portland by parents who emphasized social justice and equality values she carried into her adult life and career. She'd witnessed similar situations before in her extensive travels and had sometimes remained silent, unsure of how to intervene without making things worse. That silent complicity had always left her feeling hollow afterward. As Richard Turner walked away from James and Nicole's suite for the second time, Emily made a decision. She switched her phone to video mode and began recording, more deliberately capturing the service discrepancies as Kevin continued the beverage service, skipping row 2 entirely before serving her in row 3. "Excuse me," she said, as Kevin handed her a gin and tonic. "I believe you missed serving the couple in row 2. Kevin's professional smile tightened. "I'll be with them shortly, miss. We're just following a specific service pattern today." "I've flown Atlantic first class 8 times this year," Emily replied, keeping her voice pleasant but firm. "The service pattern is always front to back. Always." Several nearby passengers looked up, attention drawn by the exchange. Kevin's expression shifted to one of barely concealed annoyance. "As I said, I'll be with them shortly. Is there anything else you need?" "No, thank you," Emily replied, making no effort to hide the fact that she was still recording. Kevin moved away quickly, but instead of returning to serve James and Nicole, he went to the galley where Melissa and Richard were huddled in conversation. Emily observed them glancing in her direction now as well, their expressions suggesting she had just moved from the valued passenger column to something else entirely. Emily used the moment to lean forward slightly in her seat, catching Nicole's eye. She tilted her phone subtly, a silent communication that she was documenting what was happening. Nicole gave an almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement before turning back to speak quietly with James. Growing up biracial in a predominantly white city, Emily had developed a keen awareness of how prejudice operated in public spaces, the subtle codes, the plausible deniability, the ways in which people of color were made to feel unwelcome while maintaining the thinnest veneer of policy or procedure. She recognized every beat of what was unfolding before her. When Kevin finally approached James and Nicole with their drinks a full 15 minutes after serving everyone else in first class, Emily made sure to capture the interaction clearly on her phone. The flight attendant placed the drinks on their consoles without the customary napkin or nuts that had accompanied everyone else's beverages, then turned away without asking if they needed anything else. Richard noticed her filming and approached her seat with a tight smile. "Miss Carson, I need to remind you that filming the crew without permission is against our onboard policies." Emily met his gaze steadily. "I'm a travel content creator documenting my first-class experience, which you were aware of when I boarded. I'm not specifically filming crew members, just my journey. Nevertheless, I must ask you to stop recording during service interactions. It makes the crew uncomfortable. I imagine there are several things happening on this flight that make people uncomfortable," Emily replied, her meaning clear. "But I'll be mindful of your concerns." Richard's expression hardened, but he moved away without further comment. Emily immediately used the aircraft's Wi-Fi to upload the video segments she'd already captured to her cloud storage, ensuring they wouldn't be lost if her phone was later confiscated. She then opened her Instagram account, where she had nearly 1 million followers, and began a live story. "Hey everyone, coming to you live from Atlantic Airways first class on my way to Paris." She began quietly angling the camera to show her seat without capturing other passengers directly. "Having an interesting experience today that I think deserves some real-time documentation." Within seconds, viewers began joining the live stream. Emily continued, her voice low enough not to disturb others but clear enough for her microphone to pick up. "I'm observing what appears to be some pretty blatant discriminatory service happening to a couple seated in front of me. I've flown this route in first class multiple times, and what I'm seeing is, well, it's not standard Atlantic Airways service, let's just say that." Comments began flooding in, some expressing outrage, others asking for details. Emily was careful not to show James and Nicole directly respecting their privacy while still documenting the situation. "I'll keep you updated as things develop," she promised her viewers. Sometimes these situations just need a little sunlight. As she ended the initial live stream, she noticed James looking back at her, a question in his eyes. Emily gave him a small, reassuring nod, a silent communication that she saw what was happening and was not going to remain a passive witness. What Emily didn't fully realize was that her live stream had already been clipped and shared across multiple platforms, the hashtag #Atlantic Airways, shame beginning to trend in aviation and travel circles. The sunlight she had mentioned was spreading faster than anyone on board the aircraft could have anticipated. Sophia Ramirez stood in the mid-cabin galley, arranging appetizer plates for the upcoming meal service while trying to process what she was witnessing in first class. At 26, she was the junior member of the cabin crew, having worked for Atlantic Airways for just under 2 years. Today's Paris route was a coveted assignment for a flight attendant of her seniority, and she had been thrilled when the scheduling system assigned her to it. That excitement had dimmed considerably over the past hour as she observed the treatment of the couple in 2A and 2B. As a Hispanic woman who had grown up in a predominantly white suburb of Phoenix, Sophia was no stranger to subtle discrimination. She recognized the signs immediately: the tone shifts, the extra verification steps, the service omissions that were too consistent to be accidental. Sophia was not assigned to the first-class cabin today. Her position was in premium economy, but the preparation areas were shared, giving her a clear view of the dynamics unfolding. She had watched with growing discomfort as Melissa, Kevin, and Richard had created what felt like a coordinated effort to make the Bennetts feel unwelcome. When Melissa entered the galley to collect a tray of hot towels, Sophia gathered her courage. "Is everything okay in first?" she asked, keeping her tone casual. "I noticed there seems to be some confusion with the passengers in 2A and 2B. Melissa's expression hardened. "No confusion. Just some passengers who clearly aren't used to first class trying to act like they belong." The naked prejudice in the statement made Sophia flinch. "Their boarding passes are valid though, right? They're in the correct seats." "Technically," Melissa replied with a dismissive wave. "Some gate agent upgraded them without proper authorization. Richard is looking into it." Sophia knew this was false. As a check-in agent before becoming a flight attendant, she understood Atlantic's upgrade procedures intimately. Gate agents had full authority to assign seats at their discretion, especially for special occasions like anniversaries. "I think they mentioned it's their anniversary," Sophia ventured. 15 years, I heard." Melissa's expression didn't soften. "That's what they claim. Anyway, it's being handled. Focus on your section, Sophia." As Melissa returned to the first-class cabin, Sophia felt the weight of a decision pressing on her. The airline's procedures manual was clear. Any observed discriminatory treatment of passengers was to be reported immediately through the proper channels. As a crew member, she had not just a professional obligation, but a moral one to ensure all passengers received equal service, regardless of race, gender, religion, or other factors. But the reality of airline hierarchy made such reporting complicated. Melissa had been with Atlantic for over 20 years. Richard was a senior purser with direct input on junior crew evaluations. Kevin was known to be close friends with several scheduling managers. A report from someone of Sophia's junior status would likely be dismissed, or worse, could result in retaliatory scheduling that would effectively end her career before it truly began. She thought of her mother's words when she had hesitated to report racial bullying in high school. If you see wrong and do nothing, you become part of it. The memory strengthened her resolve. Sophia took out her company phone and opened the crew communication app. Rather than filing a formal discrimination report, which would alert the same senior crew members currently involved in the situation, she sent a direct message to Captain William Bradford. Request clarification on first-class service standards for today's flight. Observing inconsistent application of service protocols for passengers in 2A, 2B compared to other FC passengers. Concerned about potential service recovery issues. F.A. Ramirez. The message was carefully worded to flag the issue without making direct accusations. If questioned later, she could claim she was simply seeking guidance as a junior crew member. It wasn't the bold stand part of her wanted to take, but it was a small effort to create a record of what was happening. What Sophia didn't know was that Captain Bradford would never see her message. First Officer Davis, checking the crew communications as the captain prepared for their initial descent announcement, intercepted the message and deleted it before it reached Bradford's screen. As Sophia arranged the last of the appetizer plates, Richard entered the galley, his expression stern. "Sophia, I need you to take over beverage service in premium economy immediately." Jackson is falling behind. It was a transparent attempt to remove her from the shared galley space where she could observe the first-class situation. Sophia nodded compliantly, but as she collected her service cart, she made a decision. Using her personal phone rather than the company device, she quickly typed notes documenting what she had witnessed so far. Time-specific service discrepancies, comments made by Melissa and Richard. She tucked the phone back into her pocket and headed toward premium economy, her mind racing with the implications of what was unfolding. As she passed row 3, she made brief eye contact with Emily Carson, whose live stream she had noticed earlier. The young woman's steady gaze communicated a silent solidarity that gave Sophia a small measure of comfort. Whatever happened next, at least there would be a record, both Sophia's notes and Emily's videos. Whether that would be enough to address the situation was another question entirely. The meal service began 90 minutes into the flight. In first class, this was typically an elaborate affair with individually prepared courses, fine wines, and attentive service. For James and Nicole Bennett, it became the next battleground in the increasingly hostile environment. Richard Turner personally supervised the service, standing at the galley entrance as Kevin and Melissa distributed crisp white tablecloths to each suite. When they reached row 2, Richard intercepted Kevin, took the tablecloths from his hands, and approached James and Nicole himself. "Before we begin the meal service," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by nearby passengers, "I need to address a seating issue that's come to our attention." James looked up from his book, his expression controlled but alert. "What issue would that be, Mr. Turner?" "Our manifest indicates these suites 2A and 2B should be occupied by Diamond status members who were rerouted from yesterday's canceled flight. It appears there was an error at the gate that placed you in these specific seats instead of your original assignment." Nicole's eyebrows rose. "That's interesting, considering we watched Agent Rodriguez deliberately upgrade us from row 3 to row 2 because row 2 was unoccupied in the system." "Systems can be misleading," Richard replied dismissively. "The fact remains that these particular suites are reserved for our highest-tier passengers, and we need to honor those allocations." James closed his book and placed it on the console, his movements deliberate. "Mr. Turner, we have valid boarding passes for these seats. We were checked in properly, boarded properly, and have been in flight for over an hour. If there was a legitimate seating issue, it should have been addressed before the aircraft door closed." Richard's jaw tightened. "Sir, I understand you're disappointed, but I'm going to have to ask you to gather your belongings and move to row 7, where we have 2 available business class seats. Of course, we'll refund the fare difference." The request, effectively a demand, hung in the air between them. Around them, the other first-class passengers had gone quiet attention drawn by the confrontation, despite attempts at discretion. "No," James said simply, his voice calm but firm. "Excuse me." Richard's surprise was evident. He clearly hadn't expected direct refusal. "We purchased first-class tickets. We were assigned these specific seats by your gate agent. We are not moving to business class." Nicole added, her tone reasonable but equally firm. "If there's truly a displaced Diamond status passenger, Atlantic Airways should upgrade them to first class on the next available flight with appropriate compensation, as per your own published policy on involuntary downgrading." Richard's face flushed slightly. Being quoted company policy by a passenger was clearly not something he was accustomed to. "That's not your concern. What matters is that these specific seats are currently occupied by passengers with valid boarding passes." James interrupted, his patience visibly thinning. "Unless you can show us documentation proving these exact seats were promised to specific other passengers before we were assigned to them, we are staying right here." By now, every passenger in the first-class cabin was openly watching the confrontation. In seat 1A, Heather Lewis had removed her headphones. The older couple in 2D and 2G exchanged uncomfortable glances. In 3G, Emily Carson was once again recording discreetly on her phone. Melissa stepped forward, inserting herself into the conversation with barely concealed hostility. "Sir, you need to comply with crew instructions. It's a federal regulation." James met her gaze steadily. "I'm very familiar with federal aviation regulations, Ms. Winters. They don't require passengers to accept downgrades mid-flight without documented cause." "Are you threatening us?" Melissa asked, her voice rising slightly. "Not at all," James replied evenly. "I'm declining your request to move from the seats we were legitimately assigned." Nicole placed her hand on James's arm, both a gesture of support and a subtle reminder of their shared strategy in such situations: remain calm, stick to facts, document everything. Richard seemed to realize the confrontation was attracting too much attention. He lowered his voice, leaning closer. "Look, we can make this easy or difficult, but one way or another you will be relocated before meal service begins." "Why?" James asked directly. "What is the real reason you're so determined to move us specifically?" The question cut to the heart of the matter, stripping away the pretense of system errors and manifest issues. Richard straightened his expression, closing. "Your boarding passes may be valid, but these seats are clearly not appropriate for you. Now I'm asking one more time, please gather your belongings and follow me to row 7. The mask had slipped, revealing the ugly prejudice beneath the professional veneer. Nicole felt a cold anger settling in her chest, different from James's controlled heat, but equally powerful. "We paid for first class, we were assigned these seats, and we are not moving," she stated, each word precise and clear. "If you continue this discriminatory treatment, we will be documenting it thoroughly for review by appropriate authorities." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Are you recording this conversation?" "That's against our policy. We don't need to record it," James replied calmly. "There are plenty of witnesses." He gestured subtly toward Emily and the other attentive passengers. For a moment, Richard seemed to waver, perhaps finally recognizing the potential consequences of escalating further. Then his expression hardened again. "Kevin, please inform the captain that we have uncooperative passengers in first class." 10 minutes later, the cockpit door opened and Captain William Bradford emerged. At 59, he was a commanding presence, tall and broad-shouldered with the confident bearing of a pilot who had spent decades in command. His uniform was immaculate, his 4 gold stripes gleaming under the cabin lighting. The meal service had been suspended during the standoff, leaving the first-class cabin in an awkward limbo. James and Nicole remained in their seats, outwardly calm despite the growing tension. Around them, other passengers alternated between pretending not to notice the unfolding drama and watching with undisguised interest. Captain Bradford approached row 2, flanked by Richard Turner. His expression was neutral but authoritative as he addressed James. "Sir, I understand there's a seating issue that needs resolution." James met the captain's gaze directly. The only issue, Captain, is that your crew has decided they don't want us in these seats despite our valid boarding passes and assignment by your gate agent. Bradford glanced at Richard, who jumped in quickly. Captain, these passengers were erroneously upgraded at the gate. The seats should have been allocated to displaced Diamond status members. That would be a customer service matter, not a safety issue, Nicole pointed out, and easily resolved by appropriate compensation to any affected passengers on future flights. The captain studied them both, his expression unreadable. I'm responsible for the safety and security of this aircraft. If my cabin crew reports uncooperative passengers, I have to address the situation. We've been nothing but cooperative, James replied. We've presented our boarding passes multiple times, answered questions politely, and remained in our assigned seats as required during flight. The only thing we haven't done is agree to be downgraded based on unclear and shifting justifications. Bradford seemed to consider this, perhaps noticing the inconsistencies for the first time. Richard, can you clarify the exact nature of the seating conflict? Were these specific seats promised to other passengers? Richard shifted uncomfortably. The system shows they should have been reserved for Diamond status reallocations from yesterday's cancellation. Yet they were available for Agent Rodriguez to assign to us at check-in, Nicole added, which suggests there was no actual conflict in the system. From seat 3G, Emily Carson spoke up unexpectedly. Captain, I've been observing what's happening. I'm a frequent flyer with Atlantic, and the treatment these passengers have received differs markedly from standard first-class service procedures. Bradford turned surprised by the intervention. Miss Carson, Emily Carson. I've documented several service discrepancies over the past hour that appear to be deliberately targeting these specific passengers. The captain's expression tightened. He clearly hadn't anticipated passenger witnesses becoming involved. Ms. Carson, this matter doesn't concern you. Respectfully, Captain, it concerns everyone on this aircraft when crew members violate the airline's non-discrimination policies, Emily replied, her voice steady despite the boldness of her statement. Bradford turned back to James and Nicole, reassessing them with new scrutiny. What exactly are you alleging is happening here? James answered carefully. We're not making allegations, Captain. We're simply declining to be moved from our legitimately assigned seats without valid cause. The cause is that these seats are reserved for... Richard began again, but Bradford cut him off with a gesture. I understand your position, Richard. The captain turned back to James. Sir, while I appreciate your concerns, I need to ensure a harmonious cabin environment for the remainder of this flight. My purser has identified an issue with your seating assignment, and I'm requesting that you cooperate with his solution. It was a careful statement avoiding direct endorsement of Richard's claims while still backing his authority. James recognized the tactic immediately, the default tendency of those in command to support their team, even when the facts were questionable. Captain Bradford Nicole said, her professional experience evident in her measured tone, We understand your position. However, we purchased first-class tickets for our anniversary trip, were legitimately assigned these specific seats, and have done nothing to warrant being relocated mid-flight. If Atlantic Airways has an internal process issue regarding seat allocations, that's a matter for the airline to address without disrupting passengers who are already in flight. Bradford seemed to waver slightly, perhaps recognizing the reasonableness of her position. Before he could respond, First Officer Davis appeared at his side, having emerged from the cockpit to check on the situation. Captain, we need to resume our pre-descent checks, Davis said, his voice low. Then, apparently unable to resist adding his assessment, he continued. These passengers have been difficult since boarding. Melissa and Kevin both reported compliance issues. That's simply untrue, James stated firmly. We've complied with every legitimate crew instruction. What we haven't done is accept discriminatory treatment without question. The word discriminatory hung in the air, a direct challenge that couldn't be easily dismissed. Bradford's expression hardened slightly. I don't appreciate that insinuation, sir. "It's not an insinuation," Nicole replied. "It's an observation based on differential treatment that multiple passengers have witnessed." Bradford glanced around the cabin, noting the attentive faces of other first-class passengers. This was quickly becoming a situation with potential ramifications beyond a simple seating dispute. "Here's what's going to happen," the captain said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone used for final decisions. "You will remain in these seats for now. The meal service will proceed. But I want to be clear, any further disruption will result in more serious measures upon our arrival in Paris." It wasn't an apology or even an acknowledgement of the underlying issues, but it was a tactical retreat, an attempt to de-escalate the immediate confrontation while saving face for the crew. James nodded once, accepting the temporary resolution while recognizing it addressed none of the actual problems. "Thank you, Captain. We look forward to completing our flight without further incidents." As Bradford and Davis returned to the cockpit, Richard remained standing by row 2, his expression a mixture of frustration and barely concealed anger at having his authority undermined, however partially. "The meal service will resume shortly," he said stiffly before walking away. Nicole reached for James's hand across the divider. "That was just the beginning," James finished quietly. "He's retreated, not surrendered." Around them, the tension in the first-class cabin remained palpable. The confrontation had forced other passengers to witness and process the discrimination playing out before them. Some, like Emily Carson, had chosen to speak up. Others had remained silent, their expressions ranging from discomfort to shame to carefully maintained neutrality. What none of them yet realized was how quickly events were unfolding beyond the aircraft. Emily's live stream had been picked up by several travel blogs and social media accounts. The hashtag #Atlantic Airways Shame was trending with thousands of reposts and comments. The story was spreading from aviation circles to mainstream awareness with remarkable speed. In Denver, Atlantic Airways' social media team was already scrambling to assess and respond to the situation. In Paris, where the flight would land in approximately 6 hours, airport managers were beginning to receive media inquiries about an incident aboard an incoming flight from the United States. And in Washington, D.C., an alert system at FAA headquarters had flagged social media activity involving potential discriminatory treatment aboard a U.S. carrier, automatically generating notifications to several departments, including the offices of the FAA's senior safety inspectors and human factors specialists. The meal service resumed with painful awkwardness. Richard supervised personally, ensuring that James and Nicole received technically correct service, the same courses as other passengers served at the appropriate times, but with none of the warmth or attention that defined first-class experience. Their wine glasses weren't refilled unless specifically requested. Their courses were delivered without the descriptive introductions offered to other passengers. When James asked about the cheese selection, Melissa responded with minimal information, rather than the detailed explanation the passenger in 1D received minutes later. It was discriminatory treatment executed with just enough subtlety to maintain plausible deniability, but the pattern was unmistakable to anyone paying attention, and by now, many were. In seat 3G, Emily Carson continued documenting the discrepancies while maintaining her live stream updates during breaks in the meal service. The comments on her feed had exploded with viewers from across the world following the situation in real time and expressing outrage at what they were witnessing. In the mid-cabin galley, Sofia Ramirez observed what she could between her premium economy service duties, adding to her notes and becoming increasingly certain that intervention was necessary. During a brief break, she approached the forward galley under the pretense of restocking napkins and overheard a disturbing exchange between Richard and Melissa. Bradford gave in too easily. Richard was saying, his voice low but intense. "We can't have them staying in first class for the entire flight. It sets a precedent." "What about when we land?" Melissa asked. "Can we have them held for questioning in Paris? I've already spoken with Davis. He's going to recommend additional screening based on unusual behavior." That should create enough delay for them to miss their connection at minimum. Sophia retreated quickly before they noticed her presence, her heart racing. What she'd heard went beyond poor service or personal bias. It was a deliberate conspiracy to further harass passengers based solely on prejudice. She needed to act regardless of the professional consequences. As she returned to the mid-cabin, Sophia made a decision. Using her personal phone rather than the crew communication system, she drafted a detailed email to Atlantic Airways Ethics Hotline documenting everything she had witnessed and overheard. She set it to send automatically once the aircraft landed and had wireless connectivity. Meanwhile, in first class, the situation escalated once more when Nicole attempted to use the forward lavatory during a break in the meal service. "I'm sorry that facility is temporarily out of service," Melissa informed her with transparent insincerity. "You'll need to use the lavatory in premium economy." Nicole glanced toward the forward lavatory where the vacant sign was clearly displayed. "It appears to be functioning. It's reserved for diamond status passengers at the moment," Melissa replied, not even attempting to make the lie convincing. James, who had been observing the exchange from his seat, stood up. "That's enough," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying a new edge of finality. "This pattern of treatment has gone beyond unprofessional into deliberately hostile." Richard appeared immediately as though he had been waiting for a confrontation. "Sir, please return to your seat. My wife needs to use the lavatory and she's being denied access to a functioning facility based on fabricated restrictions," James replied, standing his ground. "If you continue to be disruptive, I'll have no choice but to involve security upon our arrival." Richard threatened. "Please do," James responded calmly. "In fact, I insist on it. We would welcome a formal investigation into the treatment we've received on this flight." The confident response clearly wasn't what Richard had expected. He faltered momentarily before recovering. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat immediately or you will be in violation of safety regulations. I will return to my seat when my wife is allowed to use the first-class lavatory she paid to access," James stated firmly. From her seat, Emily Carson called out, "I've been to the lavatory twice without any issues. There's no diamond status restriction for a bathroom." Other passengers began to murmur, the blatant discrimination becoming impossible to ignore. An older gentleman in 2D spoke up unexpectedly. "This is outrageous. Let the lady use the restroom for heaven's sake." Richard's face flushed with anger and embarrassment as he realized he was losing control of the narrative and the support of other passengers. "Fine," he snapped. "The lavatory is available." As Nicole moved past him toward the lavatory, Richard turned to James. "This incident will be reported to the captain. Interfering with crew member duties is a serious offense." "So is discriminatory treatment of passengers," James replied evenly. "I look forward to discussing both with the appropriate authorities." The confrontation had shifted something in the cabin atmosphere. The previously silent majority of passengers had begun to speak up, unwilling to remain complicit in what was now openly recognized as discriminatory harassment. When Nicole returned to her seat, James noticed Richard speaking urgently into the crew phone, his expression thunderous. Minutes later, First Officer Davis emerged from the cockpit again and made his way directly to their row. "The captain has requested that airport security meet the aircraft upon arrival in Paris," Davis informed them with poorly concealed satisfaction. "Your continued non-compliance with crew instructions has been noted in the flight log. What specific instructions have we failed to comply with?" Nicole asked directly. Davis hesitated, clearly unprepared for the question. "That's for the captain to determine. I'm simply delivering the message. Please ensure the flight log also notes our formal complaint regarding discriminatory treatment by the cabin crew," James responded. "We'll be providing a detailed account to Atlantic Airways Customer Relations, the Department of Transportation, and other relevant authorities." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Davis's face as the potential ramifications began to register. He glanced around at the attentive faces of other passengers, noting Emily's phone still recording, before nodding stiffly and returning to the cockpit. As he departed, Sofia Ramirez passed by on her way to the forward galley. She made brief eye contact with James and Nicole, her expression conveying both apology and resolve. It was a small gesture, but it communicated something important. Not everyone on the crew supported what was happening. The lines were being drawn more clearly now. What had begun as subtle discrimination had evolved into open conflict with passengers and crew members, increasingly forced to choose sides. And as the aircraft continued its journey eastward across the Atlantic, the digital evidence of what was transpiring continued to spread across social media and news platforms, ensuring that whatever happened upon landing this incident would not simply disappear. 4 hours into the flight, as the cabin lights dimmed for the rest period before arrival, Richard Turner approached James and Nicole's suite once more. His expression was grimly triumphant, suggesting he believed he had finally found leverage to assert his authority. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett." He began, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by nearby passengers. "The captain has reviewed the situation and made a final decision. For the comfort and safety of all passengers, you will be relocated to business class for the remainder of the flight." James looked up from his tablet where he had been documenting the events of the past several hours in detailed notes. "On what grounds multiple passengers have expressed discomfort with the ongoing disruptions," Richard claimed. "As purser, I have a responsibility to maintain a harmonious cabin environment." Nicole glanced around pointedly. The first-class cabin was peaceful, with most passengers either sleeping or quietly engaged with their entertainment systems. What disruptions would those be? Exactly? Richard's jaw tightened. "Your continued questioning of crew authority and refusal to follow instructions has created tension that is affecting the service experience for our premium passengers." "The only tension in this cabin," James replied calmly, "has been created by your persistent attempts to relocate us without legitimate cause. We have remained in our assigned seats, followed all safety instructions, and responded politely to increasingly hostile treatment." "This is not a negotiation," Richard stated flatly. "Melissa and Kevin will assist you in relocating your belongings. The captain has authorized me to inform you that non-compliance will result in your being met by security in Paris and potentially banned from future Atlantic Airways flights." James set his tablet aside and straightened in his seat. His expression remained composed, but there was a new resolve in his posture. "Mr. Turner, let me be absolutely clear, we will not be moving from our legitimately assigned seats. If you continue this harassment, we will be documenting it as part of our formal complaint." From across the aisle, the older gentleman in 2D spoke up again. "Leave them alone, for God's sake. They haven't done anything wrong." "Sir, please stay out of this matter," Richard responded sharply. "I will not," the man replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "My wife and I have flown Atlantic first class for 20 years, and I've never witnessed such appalling treatment of passengers. If anyone should be removed from this cabin, it's you." Richard blanched slightly, clearly not expecting opposition from a passenger he had been treating with deference. Before he could respond, Melissa and Kevin appeared at his side, creating an imposing trio blocking the aisle beside row 2. "You need to gather your belongings now," Melissa stated, her pretense of politeness entirely abandoned. Nicole shook her head. "No. We purchased these seats. We were legitimately assigned to them, and we have done nothing to warrant being relocated." "This is your final warning," Kevin added, his tone threatening. Throughout the confrontation, Emily Carson had been filming discreetly. Now she stood from her seat in 3G. "I'm documenting this entire interaction," she announced, "along with approximately 30,000 people watching my live stream right now." Richard turned sharply. "You need to stop recording immediately." "Atlantic Airways' own policy allows passengers to record their personal travel experiences," Emily countered. "And what's happening right now is very much part of my travel experience." The standoff had reached a critical point. Richard turned back to James and Nicole, calculation evident in his expression as he weighed his options. After a moment, he seemed to make a decision. "Kevin, inform the captain we need assistance," he instructed. "Melissa, prepare seats 7A and 7B for immediate occupancy." As Kevin moved toward the cockpit and Melissa headed toward business class, Richard remained standing over James and Nicole's suite, his posture rigid with barely controlled anger. "This could have been handled discreetly," he said, his voice low. "Now you've created a scene that will have consequences." "We didn't create anything," Nicole replied evenly. "We simply declined to accept discriminatory treatment without protest." Minutes later, Captain Bradford emerged from the cockpit, followed by First Officer Davis. Their expressions were stern as they approached row 2, Mr. and Mrs. Bennett. Bradford began his tone, leaving no room for discussion. "As captain of this aircraft, I have final authority over all matters of passenger safety and cabin management. I am instructing you to relocate to business class for the remainder of this flight." James met the captain's gaze directly. "Captain Bradford, with all due respect, this is not a safety issue. It's a discriminatory targeting of passengers based on prejudice." "That's a serious accusation," Bradford replied, his expression hardening. "It's an accurate one," Nicole stated. "One that numerous witnesses can confirm and that we'll be addressing through formal channels upon landing." Bradford glanced around the cabin, noting the attentive faces of other passengers and Emily's phone still recording. The public nature of the confrontation clearly made him uncomfortable, but he had committed himself to a course of action and appeared unwilling to retreat. "Security will meet this aircraft upon arrival," he stated. "Until then, you will relocate as instructed or face potential charges of interfering with a flight crew." It was a serious threat, one that could potentially result in criminal charges. James and Nicole exchanged a brief glance, silently communicating as they assessed their options. After a moment, James spoke. "Captain, we will comply under protest, and with the understanding that we are documenting this incident as a clear case of discriminatory treatment. We expect a full refund of our first-class fare, and we will be pursuing all available remedies through appropriate channels." Bradford nodded stiffly, accepting the conditional compliance without further comment. As James and Nicole gathered their belongings, the atmosphere in the cabin was thick with tension. Several passengers watched with expressions ranging from discomfort to outright dismay. The older couple in 2D and 2G shook their heads in disapproval. Emily Carson continued filming her live stream, ensuring that what was happening would not remain contained within the aircraft. The walk of shame through the first-class cabin and into business class was brief, but humiliating. As they passed row 3, Emily spoke quietly but clearly. "I have everything documented. This won't be ignored." In the mid-cabin, Sofia Ramirez stood near the galley, her expression conveying silent apology as they passed. Other passengers looked up with curiosity, unaware of the drama that had unfolded in first class. As they settled into seats, 7A and 7B, significantly less spacious and private than the first-class suites they had paid for, Melissa appeared with their amenity kits and headphones. "You'll find these seats quite comfortable," she said with artificial brightness, as though the preceding confrontation had never happened. Then, unable to resist a final dig, she added in a lower voice, "Next time, book seats you belong in." The mask had slipped completely, revealing the ugly prejudice that had driven the entire incident. James and Nicole said nothing, their silence more powerful than any response could have been. As Melissa walked away, Nicole reached for James's hand. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "Not by a long shot," he agreed, his expression determined rather than defeated. What the Atlantic Airways crew didn't realize, what they couldn't have known, was that their actions had set in motion consequences far beyond what they could imagine. As the aircraft continued its journey toward Paris, The digital evidence of what had transpired was spreading rapidly across social media platforms and beginning to attract mainstream media attention. More significantly, that evidence was now being reviewed by officials at both the Department of Transportation and the Federal Aviation Administration, including colleagues of James and Nicole Bennett, who recognized them immediately in the videos being shared online. The confrontation aboard Flight 370 was no longer just a dispute between crew and passengers. It was evolving into a high-profile case of discrimination that would soon have ramifications throughout the aviation industry. Charles de Gaulle Airport sprawled like a massive concrete organism on the outskirts of Paris, its circular terminals connected by automated trams and moving walkways. As Atlantic Airways Flight 370 taxied toward Terminal 2E, James and Nicole Bennett sat in silent contemplation in their business-class seats, mentally preparing for what would come next. The remainder of the flight had passed without further direct confrontation. Richard, Melissa, and Kevin had avoided business class entirely, delegating service to other flight attendants. Captain Bradford had not emerged from the cockpit again. It was a strained detente, with both sides seemingly content to postpone further engagement until landing. As the aircraft doors opened and passengers began the disembarkation process, First Officer Davis appeared at the front of business class. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett," he announced, loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "please remain seated until all other passengers have deplaned. Security will escort you to the terminal." The public announcement was unnecessary, clearly designed to embarrass rather than facilitate. Several business-class passengers looked at James and Nicole with curiosity or concern. From further forward in the cabin, the sound of other passengers gathering their belongings and exiting the aircraft filtered back. Emily Carson paused as she passed their row. "I'm staying in Paris at the Marriott Champs-Élysées," she said quietly. "I've uploaded all my footage to a secure cloud server and sent copies to several media contacts. If you need a witness or documentation, please contact me." She slipped a business card onto Nicole's tray table before continuing toward the exit. Sophia Ramirez also managed a brief moment of communication as she prepared the cabin for the next flight. "I've documented everything," she whispered while pretending to check the overhead bins. "The ethics report has been filed." These small gestures of solidarity provided some comfort as James and Nicole waited, increasingly isolated as the cabin emptied around them. After nearly 20 minutes, when the last regular passengers had deplaned, two uniformed figures appeared at the front of the cabin, a male security officer in the distinctive uniform of the French Border Police and a woman in the crisp corporate attire of Atlantic Airways ground staff. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett," the woman called, approaching their row. "I'm Victoria Lawson, Customer Service Manager for Atlantic Airways at Charles de Gaulle. I understand there was an incident during your flight that requires attention." Her tone was professional but cool, suggesting she had already been briefed by the flight crew and was predisposed to view them as problematic passengers. The security officer remained at the front of the cabin, watchful but not yet intervening. James and Nicole stood gathering their carry-on items. "That's one way to describe discriminatory treatment by your cabin crew," James replied calmly. Victoria's expression tightened slightly. "Let's discuss this in a more appropriate setting. If you'll follow me to our customer service office, we can address your concerns privately." As they moved toward the aircraft exit, they passed the first-class cabin where Richard, Melissa, and Kevin were completing paperwork at the forward galley. All three looked up as James and Nicole passed, their expressions a mixture of satisfaction and wariness. "You'll be hearing from us," Nicole said quietly as they walked by, her tone making it clear this was a promise rather than a threat. The walk through the jet bridge and into the terminal was tense, with Victoria leading the way and the security officer following behind them. Other deplaning passengers watched curiously, some recognizing James and Nicole from the videos that had already begun circulating online. Victoria led them to a small windowless office marked Atlantic Airways Customer Relations and gestured for them to enter. Inside were a simple desk with a computer terminal and 3 chairs. The security officer remained outside, stationing himself by the door. "Now then," Victoria began as they seated themselves, "I understand there was some confusion regarding seating assignments that escalated into a compliance issue. Captain Bradford has filed an initial report indicating non-cooperation with crew instructions." James regarded her steadily. "Ms. Lawson, what occurred on that flight wasn't confusion or a compliance issue. It was targeted discriminatory treatment from the moment we boarded." Victoria's expression remained professionally skeptical. "That's a serious allegation, Mr. Bennett." "It's an accurate one," Nicole replied. "One that numerous passengers witnessed, and at least 2 recorded extensively. Recording crew members without consent is against Atlantic Airways policy. 17.3 permits passengers to record their personal travel experiences, including interactions with crew members in the course of normal service delivery." Nicole interrupted, citing the exact policy number. "What isn't permitted is discriminatory treatment of passengers based on race or other protected characteristics, as outlined in your own non-discrimination policy and federal transportation regulations." Victoria paused clearly, surprised by Nicole's specific knowledge of airline policies. She studied them both with new attention, reassessing. "You seem very familiar with our operational guidelines." "We are," James confirmed without elaboration. "Now we'd like to file a formal complaint regarding the treatment we received today, including being forcibly relocated from our legitimately assigned first-class seats without valid cause." "I'll need to review the full situation," Victoria hedged, typing something into her computer terminal. "Captain Bradford's report indicates Captain Bradford wasn't present for most of the interactions," Nicole pointed out. "And his report is likely to reflect the version of events presented by the cabin crew rather than what actually occurred." Victoria frowned, clearly uncomfortable with being challenged so directly. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, I'm trying to help resolve this situation, but your confrontational attitude isn't." "We're not being confrontational," James interrupted calmly. "We're being precise about what occurred and requesting appropriate documentation of our complaint. If that seems confrontational to you, I suggest it may be because you've already decided we're at fault based solely on crew reports." The assessment hit home. Victoria's expression shifted slightly as she recognized the truth in his statement. She took a moment to recalibrate, then tried a different approach. "Why don't you tell me your version of events from the beginning? I'll document everything in our system." James nodded. "We boarded with valid first-class tickets for seats 2A and 2B, which we had been assigned by your gate agent Thomas Rodriguez in Denver. From the moment we entered the aircraft, we experienced differential treatment compared to other first-class passengers." He proceeded to outline the events of the flight in precise chronological detail, the initial questioning of their seating assignment, the substandard service during beverage and meal offerings, the escalating confrontations, and, ultimately, the forced relocation to business class. As he spoke, Victoria's expression gradually shifted from professional skepticism to genuine concern. She typed rapidly, documenting the account with occasional clarifying questions that suggested she was taking the matter more seriously than initially indicated. When James finished, Victoria leaned back slightly in her chair, her brow furrowed. "You mentioned other passengers witnessed and recorded these interactions." "Yes," Nicole confirmed. "Emily Carson in seat 3G documented most of it on her phone. She was live streaming to her social media platforms. Several other passengers spoke up on our behalf, including the older couple in 2D and 2G. Victoria made a note of these details, then asked a question that revealed she was beginning to recognize the potential severity of the situation. "What resolution are you seeking for this incident?" "At minimum," James replied, "a full refund of our first-class fare, formal disciplinary action for the crew members involved, and a written acknowledgement from Atlantic Airways that the treatment we received violated company policies and federal regulations." Victoria nodded slowly, continuing to type. "I'll need to escalate this to our regional customer relations director. This level of complaint is beyond my authority to resolve independently. That's fine, Nicole said. We understand the process may take time, but we do expect it to be taken seriously and addressed appropriately. Victoria looked up from her computer, studying them both with new attention. May I ask what you do professionally, Mr. and Mrs. Bennett? You seem very knowledgeable about airline policies and procedures. It was the opening they had been waiting for, the moment to shift the dynamic entirely. Before we answer that question, James said I need to make a phone call. Victoria looked surprised. Mr. Bennett, we're in the middle of processing your complaint. I don't think this call is relevant to the situation, James assured her, already taking out his phone. It won't take long. Victoria hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Very well. James dialed a number from memory and put the phone on speaker, placing it on the desk between them. After 2 rings, a crisp female voice answered. FAA Regional Director Thompson. Eleanor, it's James Bennett. James, I've been trying to reach you for the past hour. Are you and Nicole okay? Victoria's eyes widened at the familiar exchange and the title of the person James had called so casually. We're physically fine, James replied, currently sitting in the Atlantic Airways customer service office at Charles de Gaulle with their manager, Victoria Lawson. We've experienced a situation that requires official attention. I'm already aware, Eleanor Thompson responded, her voice taking on a more formal tone. Videos from your flight are circulating widely on social media. I've received calls from DOT and 3 news organizations in the past 30 minutes. I need you to give me a complete account of what happened. James proceeded to summarize the events again, this time with additional technical details about specific regulatory violations he had observed. As he spoke, Victoria's expression transformed from concern to alarm as the full implications of who she was dealing with began to register. Time and location of initial discriminatory treatment, Eleanor asked clearly, taking notes. Approximately 10:17 a.m. Mountain time during boarding in Denver, James replied. First instance was Senior Flight Attendant Melissa Winters, questioning our seating assignment despite valid boarding passes. Witnesses multiple. Emily Carson in seat 3G documented most interactions on video. The Winterses in 2D and 2G spoke up during later confrontations. Flight attendant Sophia Ramirez observed from the mid-cabin galley and indicated she has filed an ethics report. Pattern of escalation. Progressive. Started with subtle service discrepancies, escalated to open questioning of our right to be in first class, culminated in forced relocation to business class under threat of security intervention in Paris. Captain involvement. Bradford initially supported crew without investigation. First Officer Davis appeared to be actively encouraging escalation rather than de-escalation. Eleanor's sigh was audible through the speaker. This is precisely the type of incident our new training initiatives were designed to prevent. I've already spoken with our legal department. They're preparing to open a formal investigation. I need you both to document everything while it's fresh in your minds, times names, specific statements. Everything. Already in progress, Nicole assured her. I've been taking notes throughout. Good. Now what's the current status? Are you being detained? James glanced at Victoria, whose complexion had paled noticeably during the conversation. Not officially. We're filing a formal complaint with Atlantic Airways. There's a security officer stationed outside the door, but no formal detention has been stated. Understood. I'm going to contact our FAA liaison at the U.S. Embassy in Paris. Expect a call within the hour. In the meantime, continue documenting everything and cooperating reasonably with Atlantic Airways procedures, but do not sign anything or agree to any resolution without consulting with our legal team first. Understood? James confirmed. And James Nicole, I'm sorry this happened to you, especially on your anniversary trip. It's unacceptable and there will be accountability. Thank you, Eleanor, Nicole replied. We'll be in touch soon. As James ended the call, the office fell into silence. Victoria stared at them, her professional composure visibly shaken. "You're with the Federal Aviation Administration," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," James confirmed calmly. "I'm a senior safety inspector specializing in airline compliance with federal regulations. My wife is an aerospace engineer and human factors specialist focusing on crew training and safety protocols." Victoria closed her eyes briefly, processing the implications. When she opened them again, her entire demeanor had shifted. "I need to contact our regional director immediately." "That would be appropriate," Nicole agreed. "This situation has evolved beyond a standard customer complaint." Victoria stood quickly. "If you'll excuse me for a moment, I need to make some calls. Please wait here." As she hurried from the room, James and Nicole exchanged a glance that communicated volumes. The revelation of their professional identities had dramatically altered the dynamic, but they both understood this was just the beginning of what would likely be a complex and high-profile investigation. "Not exactly the anniversary trip we planned," Nicole said quietly. James reached for her hand. "We'll still have Paris, just with a slight delay." Outside the small office, they could hear Victoria speaking urgently into a phone, her voice too low to make out specific words, but her tone conveying clear alarm. The security officer who had been stationed at the door had moved several steps away, his posture noticeably less confrontational than before. The power dynamic had shifted completely, transforming them from difficult passengers to federal officials, whose mistreatment now represented a potential regulatory nightmare for Atlantic Airways. But with that shift came responsibility to ensure that what had happened to them would lead to meaningful change, rather than just individual consequences. "We need to be strategic about this," Nicole said thoughtfully. "Make sure it becomes about the pattern, not just our experience." James nodded in agreement. "Exactly. This isn't about us getting an apology. It's about making sure no one else has to go through this." As they waited for Victoria to return, they began outlining their approach for what would come next: the formal statements, the regulatory investigation, the potential policy changes that could emerge from this incident. Their anniversary vacation had unexpectedly transformed into something else entirely, an opportunity to address a form of discrimination that was all too common but rarely documented so thoroughly. Victoria Lawson returned to the office 15 minutes later, accompanied by a tall, distinguished-looking man in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit and a grave expression. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett. Victoria began, her tone now scrupulously formal. "This is Gregory Phillips, Vice President of Operations for Atlantic Airways Europe." Phillips extended his hand, his manner polished but tense. "I came immediately upon learning of the situation. On behalf of Atlantic Airways, I want to express our deep concern about your experience aboard Flight 370. James shook his hand briefly. "Mr. Phillips, I appreciate your prompt attention to this matter." "Of course," Phillips replied, taking the seat Victoria had vacated. "I've received a preliminary briefing, but I'd like to hear directly from you about what transpired. We've already provided a detailed account to Ms. Lawson," Nicole pointed out. "I assume those notes are available to you?" Phillips nodded. "They are, but in situations of this sensitivity, I prefer to hear first-hand accounts whenever possible." James recognized the tactic, a standard approach in damage control, to assess not just the facts, but the demeanor and potential determination of the affected parties. He decided to be direct rather than repeating the entire narrative again. "Mr. Phillips, what occurred on Flight 370 was a systematic pattern of discriminatory treatment directed at us from the moment we boarded. It began with questioning our legitimate seating assignment, progressed through substandard service compared to other first-class passengers, and culminated in our forced relocation to business class under threat of security intervention, all without valid cause." Phillips maintained his composed expression, though his eyes revealed his calculation of the potential ramifications. "If what you've described is accurate, it represents a serious violation of our company policies and values." "It's not a question of if," Nicole replied calmly. The incidents were witnessed by multiple passengers and extensively documented on video. Ms. Carson's live stream alone has reportedly reached over 200,000 views in the past few hours. This information visibly unsettled Phillips, who clearly hadn't been fully briefed on the extent of the social media documentation. He paused briefly before continuing. What resolution would you consider appropriate in this situation? As we mentioned to Ms. Lawson, James said at minimum a full refund of our first-class fare, formal disciplinary action for the crew members involved, and a written acknowledgement that the treatment we received violated both company policies and federal regulations. Phillips nodded slowly. Those requests seem reasonable given the circumstances. I'm prepared to authorize the refund immediately and issue a formal apology on behalf of Atlantic Airways. And the disciplinary action, Nicole pressed. We have strict procedures for investigating crew conduct, Phillips explained. I can assure you the matter will be thoroughly reviewed, but I can't commit to specific outcomes before that process is complete. James studied him for a moment, recognizing the corporate, careful language designed to acknowledge concerns while avoiding specific commitments. Mr. Phillips, I appreciate your caution, but I need to be clear about something. This incident will be subject to formal investigation by the Federal Aviation Administration, regardless of Atlantic Airways' internal processes. Yes. Ms. Lawson mentioned your professional roles? Phillips acknowledged, his expression growing more serious. I understand the potential regulatory implications. Then you should also understand that the standard corporate response of investigating quietly and internally won't be sufficient in this case, Nicole added. The evidence is already public. The violations are well documented, and as FAA officials, we have an obligation to ensure appropriate accountability. Phillips leaned forward slightly. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, I want to assure you that Atlantic Airways takes this matter extremely seriously. We are committed to addressing it transparently and comprehensively. Before he could continue, Victoria's phone buzzed. She checked the screen and looked up with visible surprise. Mr. Phillips, the U.S. Embassy is calling for Mr. and Mrs. Bennett. Phillips blinked clearly, not having anticipated this level of immediate diplomatic involvement. Please put it through. Victoria answered the call and handed her phone to James. This is James Bennett, he said, activating the speaker function so everyone could hear. Mr. Bennett. This is Daniel Harrington, FAA liaison at the U.S. Embassy in Paris. I've been briefed on the situation by Director Thompson. Are you and Dr. Bennett currently being detained by either Atlantic Airways or French authorities? Not formally detained, James replied. We're meeting with Atlantic Airways representatives to document our complaint. Good. I've spoken with the French Civil Aviation Authority, who have been notified of your official FAA status. They've assigned a representative to meet with you and escort you through any remaining airport procedures without delay. They'll be arriving at your location shortly. Phillips' expression shifted from concern to alarm. The involvement of both U.S. and French aviation authorities signaled that this incident had already escalated far beyond a standard customer complaint. Thank you, Mr. Harrington, James responded. We appreciate the embassy's prompt attention. Of course. Director Thompson has also asked me to inform you that FAA Counsel will be contacting you within the hour to provide guidance on formal statement procedures. In the meantime, the embassy has arranged hotel accommodations for you at Le Bristol if you wish to use them. That's very helpful. Thank you. After concluding the call, James returned the phone to Victoria, whose professional composure had visibly faltered in the face of rapid diplomatic intervention. Phillips cleared his throat. It seems this situation has already engaged significant official attention. Yes, Nicole confirmed simply. In light of these developments, Phillips continued, choosing his words carefully. I'd like to propose an immediate resolution regarding your personal inconvenience, separate from the broader investigation that will clearly be taking place. James nodded for him to continue. Atlantic Airways will provide a full refund of your first-class tickets, plus compensation in the amount of 10,000 euros for the disruption to your anniversary trip. We'll also arrange business class tickets on any future Atlantic route of your choosing at no cost. It was a generous offer clearly designed to separate the personal compensation aspect from the professional investigation that would follow. James and Nicole exchanged a brief glance, silently communicating their assessment. The refund is appropriate, James acknowledged. However, any additional compensation should be directed to anti-discrimination training programs for Atlantic Airways staff rather than to us personally. Our concern is ensuring organizational change, not personal benefit. Phillips appeared genuinely surprised by this response. That's an unusual request. Perhaps Nicole agreed. But it better reflects our priority, which is preventing similar incidents in the future, rather than being compensated for our experience. Before Phillips could respond, there was a knock at the office door. Victoria opened it to reveal two individuals, a woman in the formal uniform of the French Civil Aviation Authority, and a man in a business suit who introduced himself as the U.S. Consular Affairs Officer. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett. I'm Claire Dubois from the DGAC, the woman said in lightly accented English. We've been notified of the situation and are here to assist you. The presence of both French regulatory authorities and U.S. diplomatic representation transformed the dynamic in the small office completely. Phillips stood recognizing that the situation had moved beyond his ability to manage it through standard corporate channels. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, I think it's clear this matter will require more comprehensive discussion than we can complete today, he said, his tone now formally respectful. I appreciate your willingness to engage with us directly, and I assure you, Atlantic Airways is committed to addressing all aspects of this incident appropriately. We expect nothing less, James replied evenly. As they gathered their belongings to depart with the officials, Nicole turned to Phillips one final time. Mr. Phillips, this incident wasn't just about poor service or miscommunication. It was about prejudice that manifested in discriminatory treatment. We hope Atlantic Airways will acknowledge that reality directly rather than hiding behind procedural language. Phillips nodded solemnly. Your message is received, Dr. Bennett. And for what it's worth, I am truly sorry this happened during what should have been a celebration of your marriage. It wasn't a corporate statement or a carefully crafted response, just a moment of genuine human acknowledgement. Nicole appreciated it for what it was, even as she recognized that much more substantial actions would be necessary to address the underlying issues. As they left the office, escorted by the French and American officials, James and Nicole knew their anniversary trip had been irrevocably altered. But they also recognized that what had happened aboard Flight 370 had the potential to create meaningful change, not just for Atlantic Airways, but potentially for the broader aviation industry's approach to recognizing and preventing discrimination. While James and Nicole were being escorted through expedited immigration and customs procedures by the French aviation officials, Atlantic Airways' corporate machinery was shifting into crisis management mode. In a sleek conference room overlooking the main terminal at Charles de Gaulle, Gregory Phillips convened an emergency meeting with Victoria Lawson and 3 members of his executive team who had been summoned on short notice. The situation is more severe than initially reported, Phillips began, without preamble. The passengers in question aren't just any federal officials, they're senior FAA personnel with direct oversight of airline compliance and human factors training. James Bennett personally conducted our operational safety audit in Denver last year, and his wife literally wrote parts of the crew resource management protocols we use. Victoria Lawson, still visibly shaken by the rapid escalation of events, added, "The social media exposure is expanding exponentially. The videos from Ms. Carson's live stream have been picked up by major news outlets. CNN and the BBC have already requested statements." Phillips paced the length of the conference table, his expression grave. We need to get ahead of this immediately. Where are the crew members now? Still completing arrival procedures, Victoria replied. They haven't been informed about the Bennett's FAA status or the brewing media situation. Keep it that way for now, Phillips instructed. I want to interview them before they have a chance to coordinate their stories or learn about the external developments. He turned to his communications director, a sharp-featured woman who had been typing rapidly on her laptop throughout the exchange. Rebecca drafted an initial statement acknowledging we're investigating reports of a service incident aboard Flight 370. Keep it general, but emphasize our commitment to equal treatment of all passengers. What about social media? Asked the digital engagement manager, a younger man, whose expression reflected the gravity of managing a viral crisis. Pause all promotional content immediately, Phillips directed. Monitor mention volumes and sentiment, but don't engage directly with commenters discussing the incident until we have our official response prepared. As the team began executing these initial crisis management steps, Phillips stepped aside to make a call that he had been dreading. The phone rang 3 times before being answered. Elaine Crawford speaking. Elaine, it's Gregory Phillips in Paris. We have a situation developing that requires immediate attention from the executive level. Crawford, the CEO of Atlantic Airways, listened without interruption as Phillips outlined the events aboard Flight 370 and the subsequent revelations about James and Nicole Bennett's professional roles. When he finished, her response was direct and focused. Where are the Bennetts now, being escorted through the airport by French aviation officials and U.S. Embassy personnel? They've declined our initial compensation offer and requested that any settlement be directed toward anti-discrimination training programs instead. There was a brief silence as Crawford processed this information. That suggests they're more interested in structural change than personal benefit. It also means this won't go away with the standard customer relations playbook. Exactly, Phillips confirmed. And with their professional backgrounds, they know precisely how to navigate the regulatory aspects of this incident. What about the crew members involved? Still being debriefed. Initial reports suggest they genuinely didn't recognize they were engaged in discriminatory behavior. They've characterized their actions as standard protocol for passenger verification and response to non-compliant travelers. Crawford's sigh was audible through the phone. That's a problem in itself, Gregory. If they can't recognize clear discrimination in their own actions, our training has failed at a fundamental level. I agree, Phillips acknowledged. The videos make it impossible to interpret their behavior as anything but targeted and prejudicial, whatever justifications they're offering. Here's what we're going to do, Crawford said decisively. First, suspend the entire crew pending investigation, Captain, First Officer, and all cabin crew except for any who actively intervened or reported the behavior. Second issue, a public statement acknowledging that what occurred appears to be a clear violation of our values and policies without equivocation or corporate doublespeak. Third, reach out directly to the Bennetts with a request for their professional input on improving our training programs, separate from any compensation discussions. Phillips nodded, relieved that Crawford was taking a direct approach, rather than the cautious, legalistic response that corporate counsel would typically advise. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. This isn't just a PR crisis, Gregory. It's a moment that reveals where we've failed in living our stated values. We need to address it as such. As Phillips rejoined the crisis team to relay Crawford's directives, activity in the conference room intensified. Legal advisors were conferring about potential regulatory consequences. Communications specialists were drafting statements for various audiences. Human resources representatives were reviewing the employment records of the crew members involved. Meanwhile, in the crew debrief room on the opposite side of the terminal, Captain William Bradford, First Officer Andrew Davis, and the cabin crew of Flight 370 were beginning to realize that something unusual was happening. Their standard debriefing had been extended without explanation. Their company devices had been temporarily collected for routine system updates. and the friendly ground staff who normally processed their arrival paperwork had been replaced by senior operations managers who maintained professional but notably cool demeanors. Something's off. Melissa Winters murmured to Richard Turner as they waited for further instructions. "Have you checked social media?" People were filming during that situation with the business class passengers. Richard shook his head. "My phone's still with IT. But it doesn't matter, we followed protocol for non-compliant passengers. Bradford will back us up." Captain Bradford, overhearing this exchange, frowned slightly. Throughout his career, he had prided himself on maintaining authority while ensuring fair treatment for both crew and passengers. The situation with the Bennetts had left him vaguely uncomfortable, though he had ultimately supported his cabin crew's assessment, as was standard practice. Now, sensing the unusual atmosphere surrounding their arrival procedures, he was beginning to wonder if there were aspects of the incident he had failed to fully evaluate. Before he could reflect further, the debriefing room door opened to reveal Gregory Phillips, accompanied by two individuals wearing the formal identification of Atlantic Airways Internal Review Board. Their expressions were grave. Captain Bradford, Mr. Turner, Ms. Winters Phillips began formally. "I need to speak with each of you individually regarding the incident involving passengers James and Nicole Bennett on today's flight. There have been developments that require immediate attention." The tone made it clear this was not routine. Bradford straightened in his seat, his expression carefully neutral despite the sudden tension in the room. "What developments?" Richard asked, a note of defensiveness already evident in his voice. Phillips regarded him steadily. "That will be covered in your individual interviews. For now, I need to inform all of you that the passengers in question were senior Federal Aviation Administration officials, and the incident has triggered formal regulatory review procedures." The revelation landed like a thunderbolt. Melissa's face paled visibly. Richard froze in mid-motion, his cup of coffee suspended halfway to his lips. First Officer Davis, who had been leaning against the wall with casual confidence, suddenly straightened as though physically struck. Captain Bradford was the first to recover. FAA officials. There was nothing in the manifest. They were traveling privately on their anniversary trip, Phillips explained. But that distinction is largely irrelevant now. What matters is that multiple violations of company policy and potentially federal regulations occurred, and we need to establish exactly what happened and why. As the implications sank in the atmosphere in the debriefing room transformed from routine professional formality to something approaching dread, whatever justifications they had constructed for their treatment of the Bennetts were rapidly crumbling in the face of this new information. "We were just following standard procedures for passenger verification." Melissa began, her voice slightly higher than normal. Phillips cut her off with a raised hand. "Those discussions will happen in the formal interviews. For now, I need to inform you that all of you are being placed on administrative leave pending the results of our internal investigation and any external regulatory reviews." "Administrative leave?" Richard protested. "Based on passengers' complaints. That's unprecedented." "What's unprecedented," Phillips replied evenly, "is the level of documented evidence and the regulatory implications of this incident. The videos have already been viewed by hundreds of thousands of people online." The word videos seemed to hit Richard like a physical blow. He had been aware of Emily Carson filming portions of the interactions, but hadn't realized the footage would spread so rapidly or widely. "Captain Bradford, you'll be interviewed first," Phillips continued, gesturing toward one of the adjoining offices. "The rest of you please remain here and refrain from discussing the incident among yourselves until your individual interviews are complete." As Bradford followed Phillips into the office, the remaining crew members exchanged glances ranging from confused to alarmed. The professional consequences they had so confidently dismissed while in the controlled environment of the aircraft were suddenly becoming very real. First Officer Davis leaned toward Richard and whispered urgently, "FAA officials." How were we supposed to know that Richard had no answer? The question itself revealed the fundamental flaw in their thinking: the assumption that discriminatory treatment was acceptable as long as the targets lacked power or authority. It was precisely this mindset that had created the situation they now found themselves in, though none of them yet fully recognized this aspect of their failure. As the gravity of the situation settled over the crew, the broader implications were still unfolding. What had begun as an incident of discrimination aboard a single flight was rapidly evolving into a case study that would potentially reshape training programs, accountability structures, and cultural expectations throughout the airline industry. 3 hours after landing in Paris, the crew of Atlantic Airways Flight 370 found themselves in a situation none could have anticipated when they reported for duty in Denver. Captain William Bradford sat alone in a small office at Charles de Gaulle Airport, his 4 gold stripes seeming to weigh heavier on his shoulders than they had that morning. He had just completed a grueling 2-hour interview with Gregory Phillips and Atlantic Airways Internal Review Board, during which the full extent of what had occurred on his aircraft had become painfully clear. The videos captured by Emily Carson and other passengers revealed a pattern of behavior that was impossible to defend. Seeing the interactions from an outside perspective without the filter of crew solidarity, or the assumptions he had made based on fragmented information, Bradford was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth he had failed in his responsibility as captain by accepting his crew's characterization of the situation without proper investigation. In the adjacent office, Richard Turner was facing his own reckoning. The recording of his statement to James Bennett. "Your seats are clearly not appropriate for you," played on a laptop before him, the naked prejudice in his tone unmistakable when heard in isolation. "Would you care to explain what you meant by that statement?" Mr. Turner asked Harriet Donovan, the stern-faced head of Atlantic Airways Internal Review Board. Richard shifted uncomfortably. "I was referring to their boarding passes, not their... I meant the seat allocation, not... The context makes your meaning quite clear." Donovan interrupted, her expression unyielding, "especially when viewed alongside your differential treatment of other first-class passengers." In a third office, Melissa Winters sat rigid with tension as she watched a compilation of footage showing her interactions with James and Nicole compared with her treatment of other passengers. The contrast was stark, and damning warm smiles and attentive service for white passengers, cold professionalism at best for the Bennetts. "Ms. Winters, you've been with Atlantic Airways for 22 years, noted Jonathan Reed, the airline's senior HR director. In that time, have you completed our mandatory diversity and inclusion training?" "Of course," Melissa replied defensively. "Every year like everyone else. And yet, watching this footage, would you say your behavior reflects the standards outlined in that training?" Melissa's gaze dropped to the table. The question required no answer. The evidence spoke for itself. In the main debriefing room, the remaining crew members waited in tense silence. Kevin Powell paced nervously, his earlier confidence entirely evaporated. First Officer Davis stared blankly at the wall, mentally calculating the potential impact on his career. Sophia Ramirez sat slightly apart from the others, her expression resolute, despite the difficult position she now occupied as both a crew member and a witness against her colleagues. The door opened and Victoria Lawson entered with a stack of documents and a grave expression. "I need to inform all of you of the current situation," she began without preamble. "Atlantic Airways has made the decision to hold Flight 370's return to Denver. A new crew will be brought in to operate the aircraft." "We're being replaced," Kevin asked, his voice tight with alarm. "Yes," Victoria confirmed. "All crew members except for Flight Attendant Ramirez are being placed on administrative leave, pending the results of our internal investigation and any external regulatory proceedings." Sophia looked up in surprise at the exception made for her. Victoria acknowledged her with a brief nod before continuing. "You will be flown back to the United States on tomorrow morning's flight in economy class and are required to report to Human Resources upon arrival in Denver. Your company IDs and access credentials are temporarily suspended. You are instructed not to discuss this incident with media on social media or with other employees until the investigation is complete. The clinical delivery of these directives underscored the severity of the situation. This wasn't a minor service failure or a passenger misunderstanding. It was being treated with the gravity of a major operational breakdown. "What about our return accommodations?" Melissa asked, emerging from her interview with a shell-shocked expression. "The company has arranged rooms at the airport hotel," Victoria replied. "You will be escorted there shortly. You are to remain on property until departure tomorrow morning." The professional consequences were becoming starkly real. The suspended credentials, the economy class returned the escort to the hotel rather than the usual crew transportation to more comfortable accommodations in the city. But beyond these immediate impacts loomed larger questions about their future employment and professional reputations. "This is excessive," Richard protested, joining the group with visible anger on his face. "We were following procedures for handling non-compliant passengers." Victoria fixed him with a level gaze. "Mr. Turner, I've reviewed the footage and passenger statements. What I observed wasn't procedure, it was prejudice. And the fact that you still can't recognize the difference is precisely why this situation has escalated to its current level." Her blunt assessment silenced further protests. As the reality of their situation settled over the crew, individual reactions began to diverge. Captain Bradford, emerging last from his interview, appeared subdued and reflective rather than defensive. Kevin alternated between anxiety and indignation. Melissa seemed to be retreating into shocked silence. Only Sophia maintained a clear sense of purpose, knowing her documented concerns and testimony would form a crucial part of the investigation. When Victoria asked her to remain behind as the others were escorted to the hotel, she understood that her role was shifting from witness to potential contributor in addressing the organizational failures that had allowed the incident to occur. As the disgraced crew departed, Gregory Phillips rejoined Victoria and Sophia in the debriefing room, his expression grave but determined. "Ms. Ramirez, I want to thank you for your professionalism and integrity throughout this situation," he began. "Your documentation and willingness to speak up will be invaluable as we work to address the failures that occurred today." Sophia nodded, appreciating the acknowledgement but still troubled by the broader implications. "It wasn't just individual bias," she said quietly. "It was a system that allowed that bias to escalate unchecked. No one stepped in to stop it, even when it was clearly wrong." Phillips nodded in agreement. "That's precisely what we need to address, which is why we'd like you to remain in Paris for an additional day to participate in discussions with our training development team. Your perspective as a crew member who recognized the problem but felt unable to effectively intervene is crucial to understanding how we need to change." As Sophia agreed to this request, the contrast with her colleague's experience could not have been starker. While they faced potential termination and professional disgrace, she was being invited to help shape organizational reforms, a direct result of having chosen ethical action over silent complicity. The consequences for Flight 370's crew were only beginning to unfold, but already they illustrated a fundamental truth in moments of moral testing. The choices made to perpetuate discrimination, to remain silent, or to stand against injustice carried profound professional and personal implications that would reshape careers and lives in ways none had anticipated when they reported for duty that morning. The elegant suite at Le Bristol, Paris would normally have been a perfect setting for an anniversary celebration. Located in the prestigious 8th arrondissement, the five-star hotel offered luxurious accommodations with classic French decor, marble bathrooms, and views of the fashionable Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré. Under different circumstances, James and Nicole Bennett would have been delighted with the embassy's arrangement of this accommodation following their ordeal. Instead, the suite had been transformed into an impromptu operational center. Laptops, open on the antique writing desk documents spread across the Louis XV-style coffee table phones, constantly buzzing with notifications and calls. Their anniversary celebration had been temporarily set aside in favor of addressing the professional implications of what had occurred aboard Flight 370. Eleanor's team has requested a full chronological statement, James said, reviewing an email from the FAA's legal department. They're initiating a formal investigation under Title 14 CFR Part 252. Nicole nodded, typing rapidly on her own laptop. The Department of Transportation is also involved now. They've assigned a civil rights compliance officer to review the case under their passenger non-discrimination regulations. They worked with focused efficiency, applying the same professional thoroughness that had defined their careers to documenting the incident they had experienced personally. It was in some ways a blessing, the ability to channel what had been a humiliating personal experience into a structured professional response helped create emotional distance from the raw feelings of the confrontation. I'm still processing the fact that Bradford didn't recognize who we were, Nicole remarked during a brief pause in their work. You literally inspected that exact aircraft 8 months ago. James shook his head. That's actually not surprising. Inspectors interact primarily with maintenance teams and administrative personnel, rarely with flight crews, and we didn't identify ourselves professionally because we were traveling privately. Still, Nicole persisted. It speaks to a larger issue with how they approach passenger verification. If their concern was genuinely about unauthorized passengers in first class, they had multiple non-discriminatory ways to verify our identities. Exactly, James agreed. That's why this isn't just about our experience. It's about the flawed processes and cultural issues that allowed it to happen and would have allowed it to happen to any passengers who looked like us. This recognition that their ordeal was not unique, but representative of a pattern experienced by countless travelers who lacked their professional standing and resources fueled their determination to ensure the response went beyond personal redress to structural reform. A knock at the suite door interrupted their work. James opened it to find Daniel Harrington from the U.S. Embassy, accompanied by a woman he introduced as Rachel Montgomery from the FAA's International Affairs Office, who had flown in from London specifically to address the situation. Dr. and Mr. Bennett, thank you for making time for us, Montgomery began as they settled in the suite's sitting area. I know this isn't how you planned to spend your anniversary in Paris. No, Nicole acknowledged with a small smile, but perhaps it's where we can be most effective right now. Montgomery nodded appreciatively at the professional attitude. Director Thompson has briefed me on the situation. We're treating this as both an individual incident requiring specific resolution and as a case study for potential broader regulatory action. That aligns with our thinking, James confirmed. Our personal experience matters less than ensuring this doesn't continue happening to others. I should inform you that Atlantic Airways CEO Elaine Crawford has requested a meeting with both of you tomorrow, Harrington added. She's flying in from London specifically to address the situation personally. James and Nicole exchanged glances, recognizing the significance of the CEO's direct involvement. We're willing to meet, Nicole confirmed, but our focus will be on structural changes, not personal apologies. That's consistent with what she's proposing, Montgomery replied. She's specifically requested your professional input on revising their crew training protocols and accountability structures. This approach, engaging them as professional experts rather than simply as aggrieved passengers, reflected a more sophisticated understanding of both the situation and their priorities than Atlantic Airways' initial response had demonstrated. In the meantime, Montgomery continued, we've received notice that Atlantic Airways has suspended the entire crew of Flight 370 pending investigation, with the exception of a flight attendant named Sophia Ramirez, who apparently documented concerns during the flight. Sophia, Nicole recalled. She was the one who tried to signal support as we were being relocated. She seemed uncomfortable with what was happening. She's become a key witness in their internal review, Harrington confirmed. The airline has also issued a public statement acknowledging that discriminatory treatment appears to have occurred and committing to a comprehensive response. The swift and substantive actions suggested Atlantic Airways was taking the situation seriously rather than adopting the defensive, minimizing approach that corporations often employed in such circumstances. It was a promising sign, though James and Nicole remained cautiously realistic about the challenges of creating genuine cultural change within a large organization. As the meeting continued, they discussed the procedural aspects of the investigations that would follow the documentation requirements, the potential regulatory implications, the timeline for formal proceedings. Throughout, James and Nicole maintained their focus on the structural issues rather than individual penalties. The crew members involved should be held accountable. James acknowledged at one point, but firing them without addressing the conditions that enabled their behavior would just be scapegoating. The goal should be prevention, not just punishment. Nicole expanded on this perspective, drawing on her expertise in human factors. In aviation safety, we focus on failures rather than individual blame. Discrimination should be approached the same way. Yes, there's individual responsibility, but there are also organizational factors that either enable or constrain biased behavior. Montgomery nodded thoughtfully. That's a valuable framework. It's also why having professionals with your backgrounds involved in this case creates an unusual opportunity. Most passengers who experience discrimination don't have the industry knowledge to propose specific structural reforms. After the officials departed, James and Nicole took a moment to step onto their suite's small balcony, looking out over the Parisian rooftops as evening settled over the city. It was their first real pause since the incident had begun unfolding hours earlier. "Not exactly the romantic Paris evening we had planned," James remarked, putting his arm around Nicole's shoulders. "No," she agreed, leaning against him. "But maybe something meaningful will come from it. More meaningful than just our vacation." They stood together in comfortable silence for a few minutes, processing the day's events and the work that lay ahead. Their professional lives had prepared them well for the unexpected role they now found themselves in, not just as victims of discrimination seeking redress, but as catalysts for potential industry-wide reform. "We should get some rest," Nicole finally suggested. "Tomorrow will be another full day." As they turned to go back inside, James paused. "You know when this is properly addressed, not just our case, but the policies and training we're still taking that anniversary trip. Paris isn't going anywhere." Nicole smiled, the first genuine smile since the ordeal had begun. "Absolutely. This is a detour, not a cancellation." It was a small moment of personal reconnection amidst the professional response. They had been focused on a reminder that while they were leveraging their expertise to address a structural problem, they were also a couple whose celebration had been disrupted by the very issues they had spent their careers working to address in different contexts. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Their professional identities had made them targets for the crew's discrimination, and now those same professional identities gave them unusual power to ensure accountability and drive change. It was a responsibility they took seriously, even as they looked forward to eventually reclaiming the anniversary celebration that had been interrupted by circumstances none could have predicted when they boarded Flight 370 in Denver. The following morning, as Paris awakened to a crisp spring day, the official machinery of aviation regulation and corporate damage control shifted into high gear. In a conference room at the French Civil Aviation Authority headquarters near Charles de Gaulle Airport, representatives from multiple organizations gathered for the initial coordination meeting of what was rapidly becoming a high-profile international investigation. Present were officials from the FAA, the U.S. Department of Transportation, the French Civil Aviation Authority, Atlantic Airways executive team, and legal representatives from all parties. The atmosphere was formal but focused, with each entity bringing distinct priorities and perspectives to the situation. Claire Dubois from the French authority opened the proceedings. "This meeting is to establish investigation parameters and jurisdictional coordination regarding the incident aboard Atlantic Airways Flight 370. As the event occurred on a U.S. carrier in international airspace before landing on French territory, multiple regulatory frameworks apply. Rachel Montgomery from the FAA outlined the American regulatory approach. We'll be investigating under both FAA passenger rights provisions and Department of Transportation civil rights regulations. Our focus will be on regulatory compliance, crew training adequacy, and pattern identification across Atlantic Airways operations. Atlantic Airways was represented by Gregory Phillips and the company's chief legal officer, Margaret Winters, who acknowledged the gravity of the situation directly. Atlantic Airways recognizes the seriousness of this incident and is fully committed to cooperating with all investigations. We have already taken immediate actions, including crew suspension and the initiation of a comprehensive internal review. As the procedural frameworks were established, attention turned to evidence collection. Emily Carson's extensive video documentation had become central to the case, providing objective evidence that eliminated the he said, she said ambiguity that often complicated discrimination investigations. Ms. Carson has formally provided her complete footage to both Atlantic Airways and regulatory authorities, Montgomery noted. She's also agreed to be interviewed as a witness. Additionally, several other passengers have come forward with statements and supplementary recordings. The investigation was proceeding with unusual speed and thoroughness, driven by both the clear evidence and the high-profile nature of the case. What might typically have taken weeks to organize was happening in real time, with resources and attention focused intensely on understanding not just what had happened aboard Flight 370, but why it had happened and how similar incidents could be prevented. Meanwhile, in another part of Paris, Sofia Ramirez sat across from Atlantic Airways' training development director in a hotel meeting room. Her notes from the flight were spread before them as she provided detailed insights into the crew dynamics she had observed. It wasn't just the three main instigators, Melissa Richard and First Officer Davis Sophia explained. It was also how Captain Bradford defaulted to supporting his crew without investigation, and how other crew members remained silent despite visibly uncomfortable expressions when witnessing the interactions. "And you felt unable to effectively intervene?" the director prompted. Sophia nodded. The hierarchical structure made direct contradiction of senior crew members seem impossible. There was no clear pathway to register concerns without being seen as undermining authority, which is itself considered a safety risk in our training. This perspective from a crew member who had recognized the discrimination but felt constrained by organizational structures from effectively addressing it was proving invaluable to understanding the cultural and procedural failures that had enabled the incident. Across the city at Le Bristol, James and Nicole Bennett were preparing for their meeting with Atlantic Airways CEO Elaine Crawford. They had spent the morning on a conference call with Eleanor Thompson and the FAA's General Counsel discussing the regulatory aspects of the case and providing detailed statements about their experience. The key question isn't whether discrimination occurred. The evidence clearly establishes that the FAA Counsel had noted. It's whether this represents an isolated incident or a pattern within Atlantic Airways operations. We've initiated a review of previous passenger complaints to identify potential trends. Now, as they waited for Crawford's arrival, James and Nicole focused on clarifying their priorities for the meeting. We need to emphasize the distinction between individual accountability and structural reform, Nicole reiterated. The crew members involved should face appropriate consequences, but firing them without addressing the underlying issues would be an incomplete response. James agreed. And we should push for transparency in whatever reforms they implement. Public commitments with measurable outcomes, not just internal policy revisions that disappear into corporate handbooks. When Crawford arrived, accompanied by Atlantic Airways' Chief People Officer, her approach immediately distinguished itself from the initial corporate response they had encountered upon landing. There were no carefully couched statements, no ambiguous corporate language, just a direct acknowledgement of failure, Dr. and Mr. Bennett. What happened on Flight 370 represents an inexcusable failure not just of individual judgment, but of our organizational culture and training. Crawford began. I'm here not to make excuses or offer token apologies, but to engage with you on how we address the structural issues that allowed this to occur. The candid approach established a productive foundation for the discussion that followed. Crawford outlined the immediate actions Atlantic Airways had taken. "We've suspended the primary crew members involved and initiated termination proceedings for Richard Turner and Melissa Winters based on clear evidence of discriminatory conduct. Captain Bradford and First Officer Davis are under review for their roles in escalating rather than resolving the situation. We've issued a public statement acknowledging that discrimination occurred and committing to comprehensive reforms." These steps addressed the individual accountability aspect, but Crawford continued to the structural elements. "More importantly, we recognize that this incident reflects failures in our training reporting mechanisms and organizational culture. This is where we would particularly value your professional insights, given your expertise in aviation safety systems and human factors." The acknowledgement of their professional knowledge, treating them as experts rather than just aggrieved customers, created space for a substantive discussion about potential reforms. Nicole outlined approaches to anti-bias training that integrated with existing safety protocols, rather than existing as separate, easily ignored sensitivity modules. James proposed accountability structures that protected crew members who reported discriminatory behavior from hierarchical repercussions. Crawford listened attentively, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. "Would you be willing to serve as consultants to our training redesign process?" she asked eventually. "Your perspectives both as aviation professionals and as individuals who experience this discrimination firsthand would be invaluable." James and Nicole exchanged glances, considering the request. It represented an opportunity to influence meaningful change from within, but also raised questions about potential conflicts of interest, given the ongoing regulatory investigations. "We'd need to establish clear parameters," James replied carefully. "Any consulting role would need to be disclosed to and approved by the FAA Ethics Office given our positions and the active investigations." Of course, Crawford agreed immediately. Complete transparency is essential, and to be clear, this would be a paid consulting arrangement at standard industry rates, not an attempt to resolve the incident itself through financial compensation. The distinction was important, recognizing their professional value rather than attempting to buy off their complaint. They agreed to consider the proposal pending ethical clearance, with the understanding that any consulting would focus on forward-looking reforms rather than the specific incident investigation. As the meeting concluded, Crawford addressed the personal aspect they had largely set aside during the professional discussion. "I understand this incident disrupted what was meant to be your anniversary celebration. While no corporate response can fully address that harm, I want you to know that Atlantic Airways will cover all expenses for an extended stay in Paris once the immediate investigation requirements are complete should you choose to continue your trip." It was a thoughtful acknowledgement of the personal impact offered without expectation that it would erase or excuse what had occurred. James and Nicole accepted the gesture in the spirit it was offered not as compensation for discrimination but as a practical step to salvage some portion of the celebration that had been interrupted. As Crawford departed, the Bennetts reflected on the dramatic evolution of Atlantic Airways' response from the initial defensive posture they had encountered upon landing to the CEO's direct engagement with both accountability and reform. It suggested a potential path forward that addressed their core concern, ensuring that what had happened to them would not continue happening to others who might lack their professional standing and resources. The official investigations were just beginning, with multiple regulatory bodies coordinating complex reviews that would unfold over weeks and months. But the immediate corporate response had already shifted from damage control to substantive engagement with the underlying issues, a promising sign that this incident might indeed catalyze meaningful change, rather than simply resulting in performative apologies and minimal compliance. 6 weeks after the incident aboard Atlantic Airways Flight 370, the consequences for the individuals involved had become clear and, in some cases, career-defining. In a conference room at FAA headquarters in Washington, D.C., Eleanor Thompson updated James and Nicole Bennett on the outcomes of the various investigations and proceedings that had unfolded since their return from Paris. The regulatory and corporate responses have been unusually comprehensive. Thompson began sliding a folder across the table. Atlantic Airways has finalized its disciplinary actions, and the Department of Transportation has completed its initial civil rights compliance review. The folder contained a detailed summary of the consequences for each crew member involved in the incident. Melissa Winters, the senior flight attendant who had initiated the discriminatory treatment, had been terminated for cause. Her personnel file now contained documentation of multiple violations of Atlantic Airways' non-discrimination policies and federal transportation regulations. More significantly, the FAA had revoked her flight attendant certification, an extremely rare action that effectively ended her career in commercial aviation. The investigation had uncovered previous passenger complaints against Winters that had been inadequately addressed, suggesting a pattern rather than an isolated incident. Richard Turner, the purser who had escalated the situation and made the most explicitly discriminatory comments, had also been terminated. Like Winters, he had lost his FAA certification with the review board, citing demonstrated lack of judgment and failure to maintain the professional standards required for commercial cabin operations. He had attempted to contest the termination through the airline's internal appeal process, but had withdrawn his challenge after being confronted with the extensive video evidence of his conduct. Captain William Bradford's case had been more complex. While he had not initiated the discrimination, he had failed in his duty as captain to properly investigate the situation and had ultimately endorsed the improper removal of passengers from their assigned seats. After extensive review, Atlantic Airways had suspended him for 6 months without pay and required him to complete comprehensive retraining before reinstatement. The FAA had placed his pilot certification under review, imposing a probationary period during which any further incidents would result in revocation. First Officer Andrew Davis had received similar sanctions, a 6-month suspension, and mandatory retraining with particular emphasis on crew resource management and the captain's responsibility to independently verify situational assessments rather than reinforcing potentially biased crew perceptions. Kevin Powell, the flight attendant who had participated in the discriminatory service patterns, had received a 3-month suspension and been required to complete extensive anti-bias training before returning to duties. Unlike Winters and Turner, whose actions had been deemed irredeemable, Powell's lesser role and lack of explicitly discriminatory statements had created a path for potential rehabilitation. "And what about Sophia Ramirez?" Nicole asked, noting that the flight attendant who had documented concerns wasn't mentioned in the summary. "That's actually one of the more positive outcomes," Thompson replied. "Based on her actions during the incident and her contributions to the investigation afterward, Atlantic Airways has promoted her to a newly created position, Ethics and Inclusion Specialist, within their training department. She'll be working directly with their curriculum development team on implementing the reforms that emerged from this case." James nodded with satisfaction. That's appropriate recognition for someone who tried to do the right thing within a system that made it difficult. The individual consequences reflected a nuanced approach to accountability, distinguishing between the instigators whose actions were deemed fundamentally incompatible with their professional responsibilities and those who had failed through complicity or poor judgment, but might be rehabilitated through appropriate intervention and training. Thompson continued with the broader organizational outcomes. The Department of Transportation's Civil Rights Division has imposed a $3.5 million fine on Atlantic Airways, one of the largest ever for a discrimination case. However, the structure of the settlement allows the airline to direct $2 million of that amount toward implementing approved anti-discrimination programs and training reforms. That aligns with our emphasis on structural change rather than just punitive measures, Nicole observed. "Exactly," Thompson agreed. "And that's where your consulting work has been particularly valuable. The reforms you've helped design are being incorporated not just at Atlantic Airways, but as potential models for the industry. The consulting arrangement, carefully structured to avoid conflicts of interest and approved by the FAA Ethics Office, had allowed James and Nicole to channel their professional expertise toward creating meaningful change. Their unique perspective as both aviation professionals and targets of discrimination had informed training protocols that addressed the specific failures they had experienced firsthand. "What about the passengers who intervened?" James asked, thinking particularly of Emily Carson, whose documentation had been crucial to establishing the facts of the case. "Ms. Carson has become something of a public advocate on these issues," Thompson replied. Atlantic Airways initially approached her with concerns about the social media exposure, but ultimately engaged her as a consultant on passenger experience. Her travel channel now includes regular segments on passenger rights and ethical travel practices. As they reviewed the remaining details of the various proceedings, James and Nicole reflected on the unusually thorough response to what might, under different circumstances, have been minimized or dismissed as a routine customer service issue. The combination of clear video evidence, their professional standing, and the viral social media attention had created accountability that was often lacking in similar cases involving less privileged or connected passengers. "We can't lose sight of that disparity," Nicole noted as they concluded the meeting. "The system shouldn't require FAA credentials and a viral video to work properly." Thompson nodded in agreement. "That's why the structural reforms are so important. This case has created an opportunity to address the underlying issues, not just resolve an individual incident." As they left FAA headquarters, James and Nicole carried with them a complex mix of emotions: satisfaction that accountability had been established, hope that the reforms would prevent similar incidents for future travelers, but also awareness that their case represented the exception rather than the rule in how discrimination complaints were handled. The individual consequences, while significant, were ultimately less important than the structural changes their experience had catalyzed, changes designed to alter the conditions that allowed discrimination to occur, rather than simply punishing those who had enacted it in this particular instance. 3 months after the incident aboard Flight 370, Atlantic Airways CEO Elaine Crawford stood at a podium in the company's Denver headquarters, addressing an audience that included airline executives, regulatory officials, industry representatives, and media. The occasion was the formal announcement of the comprehensive reforms Atlantic Airways was implementing in response to the discrimination case that had generated international attention and scrutiny. "Today marks not an endpoint but a beginning," Crawford stated, her tone both solemn and determined. What occurred aboard Flight 370 revealed failures that went beyond individual actions to fundamental gaps in our training, reporting mechanisms, and organizational culture. The changes we're announcing today represent our commitment to addressing those failures comprehensively and transparently. Behind her, a large screen displayed the key components of Atlantic Airways' inclusion in the AIR initiative. A completely redesigned training program for all 32,000 employees developed in consultation with diversity experts and aviation professionals, including Dr. Nicole Bennett. The program integrated anti-bias education directly into operational safety training, rather than treating it as a separate sensitivity module easily dismissed or forgotten. A new reporting system that allowed crew members to flag potential discriminatory incidents without fear of hierarchical repercussions, including an anonymous ethics hotline and a non-retaliation policy with specific enforcement mechanisms. The establishment of an independent oversight committee comprising diverse industry experts, civil rights advocates, and passenger representatives. This committee would have audit authority over discrimination investigations and would publish quarterly reports on incidents resolutions and ongoing issues. Revision of crew evaluation metrics to explicitly include inclusive service delivery, alongside traditional measures like safety compliance and customer satisfaction. A partnership with other major airlines to share data on discrimination incidents. Successful intervention strategies and training best practices, transforming what had been a competitive disadvantage into an industry leadership position. These changes represented a significant organizational investment, not just the $2 million allocated from the DOT settlement, but an additional $8 million in training development system implementation and ongoing monitoring resources. It was a level of commitment that went beyond typical corporate damage control to substantive reform. We recognize that policies on paper mean nothing without consistent implementation and accountability. Crawford continued, "That's why we've established specific measurable goals and will be publishing our progress toward those goals quarterly beginning today." She gestured toward the screen, which now displayed the initial metrics number of employees trained under the new curriculum baseline data on reported incidents, response time analytics, and diversity statistics for both passengers and crew. Transparency is essential to accountability, Crawford emphasized. We cannot and will not hide behind corporate confidentiality when it comes to our progress or lack thereof in addressing these issues. Among the audience, James and Nicole Bennett observed the presentation with measured optimism. They had been invited as consultants rather than participants in the public announcement, a distinction they had specifically requested to maintain appropriate professional boundaries given their ongoing regulatory roles. The reforms Crawford was outlining incorporated many of the recommendations they had made during their consulting engagement, adapted and expanded through Atlantic Airways' internal processes. The emphasis on structural change rather than just individual training was particularly encouraging, addressing the conditions that enabled discrimination rather than simply instructing employees not to discriminate. The true test will be implementation and consistency, Nicole murmured to James as Crawford concluded her remarks and opened the floor for questions. Agreed, James replied quietly. But the public commitments and specific metrics create accountability pressure that will be difficult to ignore. The first question from the media addressed precisely this concern, Ms. Crawford. How can passengers be confident these changes represent genuine reform rather than a temporary response to negative publicity? Crawford's answer was direct. The accountability mechanisms we've established, particularly the Independent Oversight Committee and public reporting requirements, ensure that our commitment will continue regardless of public attention. Additionally, the regulatory agreements we've entered into with the Department of Transportation and FAA include legally binding compliance requirements with significant penalties for failure to maintain these standards. Another reporter asked about the airline industry's historical challenges with diversity and inclusion. Atlantic Airways isn't the first airline to face discrimination complaints. What makes your approach different from previous corporate responses that have produced limited, lasting change? 3 key differences, Crawford replied without hesitation. First, we're approaching this as a structural issue requiring organizational change, not just individual training. Second, we've integrated anti-discrimination practices directly into our operational protocols rather than treating them as separate soft skill considerations. And third, we've established external accountability mechanisms rather than relying solely on internal oversight. As the press conference continued, James and Nicole exchanged glances of cautious approval. The approach being outlined represented a significant evolution from standard corporate crisis management, acknowledging failures directly, establishing clear accountability mechanisms, and focusing on prevention through structural change rather than just punishing individual offenders. Following the formal presentation, Crawford approached them during the reception that followed. Your insights were invaluable in shaping these reforms, she acknowledged, particularly the integration of inclusion principles into our existing safety frameworks rather than creating a separate training silo. That was the key insight from my human factors work, Nicole explained. When inclusion is treated as separate from real operational concerns, it becomes optional in practice, regardless of official policy. By integrating it directly into safety protocols, it becomes part of the core operational culture, rather than an add-on. Crawford nodded in agreement. We've already seen the difference in how the training is received. Crew members engage differently when they understand these aren't just abstract social concepts, but integral components of passenger safety and operational excellence. The conversation continued briefly, touching on implementation challenges and success metrics, before Crawford was called away to speak with other attendees. As she departed, she added one final comment. "By the way, that rain check for your anniversary trip to Paris remains open whenever you're ready to claim it." It was a small personal acknowledgement amidst the larger structural changes, a reminder that behind the policies, metrics, and corporate initiatives were real people whose experiences had triggered this cascade of reforms. For James and Nicole, it represented the complex intersection of their professional expertise and personal experience that had defined this unusual chapter in their lives. As they prepared to depart the event, they were approached by Sofia Ramirez, now in her role as Ethics and Inclusion Specialist. Her professional confidence had visibly grown in the months since the incident, her previous hesitation replaced by purposeful engagement with her new responsibilities. "The training implementation is going well," she reported. "We're seeing particularly strong engagement from junior crew members who previously felt unable to intervene when witnessing problematic behavior." "That's encouraging," James replied. "The hierarchical barriers were a key factor in allowing the situation to escalate aboard Flight 370. Sophia nodded in agreement. "We've specifically addressed that in the new protocols. Crew members now have protected channels for raising concerns that bypass the traditional chain of command when necessary." As they discussed the practical aspects of implementation, what became clear was that the reforms were not merely theoretical or performative. They were being operationalized in ways that addressed the specific failures that had occurred aboard Flight 370, with attention to the human factors and organizational dynamics that had enabled those failures. The incident that had begun as a personal humiliation for James and Nicole had evolved into something much larger, a catalyst for organizational change that would potentially benefit countless future passengers. It wasn't a perfect resolution. No corporate reform could fully address the deep-seated societal biases that had manifested aboard that flight, but it represented meaningful progress toward more equitable treatment in a context where such progress had historically been difficult to achieve. As they left the event and headed to dinner at a nearby restaurant, Nicole reflected on the journey that had unfolded since that confrontation in first class 3 months earlier. "It's strange to think that something so negative could lead to positive change on this scale. That's often how progress happens," James replied thoughtfully. "Not through smooth, planned evolution, but through moments of crisis that force acknowledgement of problems that were always present but easily ignored." Their discussion continued over dinner, shifting gradually from the professional dimensions of the case to their long-delayed anniversary plans. After months of focusing on the regulatory and reform aspects of the incident, they were finally ready to reclaim the personal celebration that had been interrupted. A Paris trip, now rescheduled for the following month. What had begun as discrimination had transformed into a catalyst for change, not through easy reconciliation or simple apologies, but through the hard work of accountability, reform, and structural revision. For James and Nicole, there was satisfaction in knowing that their professional expertise had contributed to changes that would benefit others, even as they looked forward to finally enjoying the anniversary celebration that had been so dramatically derailed. 1 year after the incident aboard Atlantic Airways Flight 370, James and Nicole Bennett stood at the podium of the National Civil Rights Aviation Conference in Washington, D.C. Before them sat an audience of industry representatives, regulatory officials, civil rights advocates, and aviation professionals. The conference had been organized specifically to assess the impact of what had come to be known in aviation circles as the Bennett case and its implications for addressing discrimination in air travel. What happened to us was not unique. Nicole began addressing the fundamental point that had driven their involvement in the reforms that followed. The only unusual aspect was the combination of circumstances that created accountability: clear video evidence, social media attention, and our professional positions within the regulatory framework. James continued the theme. "The question before us is not how to handle cases with those specific characteristics, but how to ensure that all passengers receive equitable treatment regardless of their race, professional status, or ability to document discrimination when it occurs. Over the previous year, the reforms initiated at Atlantic Airways had begun to demonstrate measurable results: a 64% reduction in passenger-reported discrimination incidents, a 78% increase in internal reports of potential bias, indicating greater willingness to address problems proactively, and significant improvements in diversity metrics throughout the organization. More importantly, the Atlantic Airways model had begun to influence practices across the industry. 4 other major carriers had adopted similar integrated training approaches. The Department of Transportation had issued new guidelines for anti-discrimination compliance programs based on the structural reforms pioneered in response to the Bennett case, and the Independent Oversight Committee established at Atlantic Airways had become a template for similar accountability mechanisms at other airlines. Nicole's expertise in human factors had proved particularly valuable in designing training protocols that addressed the cognitive and organizational aspects of discrimination rather than relying solely on policy statements or diversity awareness. Her approach integrated anti-bias practices directly into existing safety and service frameworks, making inclusion an operational requirement rather than a separate consideration. The key insight she explained to the conference attendees was recognizing that discrimination in service delivery isn't just a social or ethical issue, it's an operational failure that compromises the fundamental purpose of commercial aviation to transport all passengers safely and effectively to their destinations. James's background in compliance and safety inspection had similarly informed the accountability structures that gave the reforms teeth beyond good intentions. Policies without verification are just suggestions, he noted. The Independent Oversight Committee, public reporting requirements, and integration of inclusion metrics into operational evaluations create continuous accountability pressure that sustains change beyond the initial response to a specific incident. As they concluded their presentation and took questions from the audience, the Bennetts emphasized that their involvement had always been focused on structural reform rather than personal redress. The settlement they had eventually accepted from Atlantic Airways had been directed entirely toward establishing a scholarship program for underrepresented students entering aviation careers, another aspect of addressing the industry's historical diversity challenges. "Our goal was never punishment for its own sake," James explained in response to a question about the crew members who had lost their jobs and certifications. "Those consequences were necessary for accountability. But meaningful change requires addressing the conditions that enabled their behavior, not just removing individuals who exhibited it most egregiously." Following the conference, as they walked through the National Mall enjoying a rare moment of leisure amidst their professional commitments, Nicole reflected on the unexpected journey that had unfolded from their interrupted anniversary trip. It's still hard to believe that what started as such a negative experience has led to such significant positive changes, she observed. James nodded in agreement. "I keep thinking about all the passengers who experienced similar treatment but didn't have the platform or resources to create accountability. The real measure of success will be whether these reforms protect those travelers, not just people in our position." They had eventually taken their rescheduled anniversary trip to Paris, 3 months after the original planned date. Atlantic Airways had fulfilled its commitment to cover all expenses, though they had chosen to fly with a different carrier for understandable reasons. The delayed celebration had been meaningful and enjoyable, but also shaped by the perspective gained through the intense weeks of investigation and reform development that had followed the incident. Now, a year later, they had integrated this unexpected chapter into both their personal narrative as a couple and their professional lives as aviation specialists. The experience had informed Nicole's approach to human factors training with new emphasis on the intersection of safety protocols and equitable treatment. It had similarly influenced James's inspection methodologies, expanding his focus to include the cultural and procedural factors that enabled or constrained discriminatory practices. What had begun as discrimination had become a catalyst for change, not through simplistic resolutions or performative apologies, but through the difficult, detailed work of reforming structures, policies, and practices to address the conditions that allowed bias to manifest in service delivery. It wasn't a perfect or complete solution to the deep-seated societal issues that had surfaced aboard Flight 370, but it represented meaningful progress in an industry where such progress had historically been difficult to achieve. As they completed their walk and prepared to head to dinner with colleagues from the conference, James and Nicole exchanged a glance that communicated their shared perspective on the journey they had traveled both literally and figuratively since that confrontation in first class a year earlier. The experience had been challenging and at times painful, but the impact of their response extended far beyond their personal story to create lasting change for countless travelers who would never know their names or story. That impact, the structural reforms, the accountability mechanisms, the cultural shifts they had helped initiate was perhaps the most meaningful anniversary gift they could have received, the knowledge that their expertise and advocacy had helped create a more equitable experience for future passengers facing the same biases they had encountered aboard Atlantic Airways Flight 370. If this story of justice resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed or experienced discrimination while traveling? What do you think was the most important change that came from the Bennett's experience? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share with friends and family. Every view helps spread awareness about the importance of standing up against discrimination and the power each of us has to create meaningful change. Remember, true change happens not just through individual actions, but through transforming the systems that allow discrimination to thrive. Your voice matters in this ongoing journey toward more equitable treatment for all.